Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories for Sleep. I'm here to guide you through another night, helping you drift into calmness with a story that'll stay with you long after the lights go out. Before we dive in, take a second, hit like, subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're listening from. What time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Either way, this moment is yours. So, get comfortable, let the tension melt away, and prepare to lose yourself in a story that'll leave you wondering long after the last word. Ready? Let's begin. There's something unsettling about a child who doesn't speak. It's not the silence itself, it's what it hides within. And in that house on Maple Street, in the quiet town where every neighbor knows your name and your business, no one could quite put their finger on what it was that made the child so different. It started slowly at first. The boy, let's call him Alex, though he never much cared for that name, it seemed, was a quiet one, not in a shy, introverted way, but in the kind of silence that gnawed at you from the inside out, like the weight of an unspoken word pressing against your chest. His parents, Dan and Lydia, had tried everything to make him speak. They'd enrolled him in speech therapy, pushed him to make noises with his toys, even bought the latest in child development gadgets that promised to help their child speak. But nothing ever worked. Alex was simply mute, and yet his eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes. They were wide, dark, and always so watchful, as though he could see right through the world, to something beyond it. No one, not even his parents, could ever figure out what it was he was looking for. But it was that gaze that unsettled everyone. For the first few years, it was something they could ignore. A child who didn't talk was hardly an anomaly, especially in a town like theirs, where the strange could often be brushed aside as just another passing eccentricity. But things started to shift when Alex reached the age of 5. That was the first time Lydia noticed the pictures. It had been a long day, and Lydia was exhausted. She'd been up late, sorting through the clutter of the house, sorting through memories, more than likely, when she heard it, the soft, steady scratching of a pencil against paper. She had glanced up, expecting to find her son playing with his toys. What she didn't expect to see was Alex sitting at the dining table, his face lit by the dim glow of the table lamp, furiously scribbling on a piece of paper. "Alex," Lydia called, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "What are you drawing, honey?" Alex didn't respond. He never did. Instead, he continued to draw, his tiny hand moving swiftly, purposefully, as though guided by an invisible force. Lydia walked over, her feet light so as not to disturb him. She hovered over his shoulder, her gaze drifting down to the paper. At first, it seemed like the usual scribbles, abstract shapes, half-formed figures that no one could make sense of. But the longer she stared, the more a cold shiver ran up her spine. It was as though the shapes were shifting, twisting, becoming clearer the longer she looked. In the center of the paper, Alex had drawn a figure. It was not a person she recognized, but it was unmistakable. A man, bent at an odd angle, lying in a crumpled heap. His head was tilted unnaturally, as though something had broken it. His face was barely visible, but the expression was unmistakable, an eerie, distorted grin. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "Alex," she murmured again, her voice shaky this time. "Where did you learn to draw this?" Alex didn't answer, of course. He never did. Instead, he looked up at her, those wide black eyes staring directly into hers. There was something unsettling about his gaze in that moment. Something knowing, like he was aware of something she was not. The drawing was wrong. It was too vivid, too detailed. Lydia tried to shake off the feeling. It's just a drawing, she told herself. It's just a drawing. But it wasn't. Lydia knew it wasn't. Something about it gnawed at her. Something deep in her gut told her that this wasn't just the product of a child's imagination. This was something else. The night passed uneventfully. Alex went to bed without a word, as always, and Lydia tucked the drawing into a drawer, trying to dismiss it. But the memory lingered, like a bitter aftertaste in her mind. The following days were a blur of routine: work, cleaning, shopping. Alex, as always, was quiet. He played by himself most days, the only sounds from the house being the occasional rustle of paper as he scribbled away at the dining table. And each time Lydia glanced at the drawings, a chill would creep up her spine. But it wasn't until the day the accident happened that Lydia began to understand the true meaning behind Alex's silence and his drawings. It was a Saturday afternoon when it occurred. Dan had taken Alex to the park to get some fresh air, leaving Lydia at home. She had decided to catch up on some laundry and household chores. The hum of the washing machine providing a monotonous backdrop to her thoughts. Then, just as she was folding a pile of towels, she heard the sound of sirens. It wasn't uncommon to hear sirens in town, especially on weekends when the streets were more crowded. But this time, the sound seemed to linger, growing louder and louder, until it almost felt like it was coming from right outside the house. Lydia paused, the towel in her hands falling to the floor as a sudden unease settled over her. She glanced toward the window, wondering if it was just a fire truck passing by. But when she looked outside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. There, in the street just a few houses down, was a crowd gathered around an overturned car. The sound of frantic voices filled the air, mixed with the wail of sirens and the faint cry of a child. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. "Dan," she muttered, her hands trembling as she reached for the phone. She dialed his number, but there was no answer. Her breath quickened. Her mind raced as she struggled to push past the rising panic. She threw on her shoes and bolted outside, her feet pounding against the pavement as she rushed toward the scene. Her heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts a jumbled mess. When she reached the crowd, she saw paramedics kneeling by the car, working frantically. One of them was holding a limp, lifeless child in their arms. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The child was too familiar. It was a girl, a little girl with wild, brown hair. Lydia had seen her before, just a few days earlier. She had been playing in the park with her mother. She had waved at Alex as they passed by, smiling brightly. But now, she was still, lifeless. As the scene unfolded before her, Lydia's heart twisted in pain. She felt something strange and heavy settle over her. Something she couldn't explain. Something deep within the pit of her stomach. Then, in the distance, Lydia heard a sound that stopped her in her tracks. It was a voice, high-pitched like a child's. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent, but it was unmistakable. It was Alex. She turned, and there he was, standing across the street. His dark eyes were locked onto her, his gaze intense, almost too intense. He stood perfectly still, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. But it wasn't a smile of innocence. It was the same smile from the drawing. the smile of the man lying in the crumpled heap. Lydia's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing, 1,000 thoughts spinning at once. Could it be? Could Alex have known? How could he have known? But the moment she tried to approach him, something stopped her, a heavy, overwhelming sense of dread. She stood frozen, staring back at her son, who simply stared back at her, unblinking, waiting for something. The sirens continued to wail in the background, but all Lydia could hear was the silence that hung between them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. No more sirens, no more voices, just the sound of Alex's silence. And Lydia couldn't help but wonder, what was her son really drawing for? The world never looked the same after that day. Lydia couldn't explain it. She couldn't put it into words, no matter how hard she tried. But the instant Alex had stood there, frozen in that unsettling silence, watching her from across the street, something inside her had shifted. It wasn't just the death of the little girl. No, it was the feeling that lingered like an unwanted guest. That feeling that Alex had known, that Alex had seen it all unfold in ways she couldn't understand. She told herself it was all just a coincidence, a terrible, tragic coincidence, that the drawing, the one of the crumpled man, the twisted, sickening smile, was nothing more than a child's imagination run wild. Kids have vivid imaginations, after all, don't they? But Lydia could feel it, that gnawing pit in her stomach that told her there was more to Alex than anyone could understand. There was something he wasn't saying, something he never would say. The following days were an uneasy blur. Lydia and Dan tried to return to normal. They tried to ignore the heavy silence that clung to the house, but it was hard. Every corner of their home seemed to breathe with a presence they couldn't see, couldn't name. It wasn't a feeling of someone being there. No, it was the sensation of something watching them, something that was always just out of sight, always lurking in the peripheral. Alex, of course, said nothing. He never spoke, but the drawings had taken a dark turn. One morning, just as Lydia was preparing breakfast, she heard the familiar sound again, the soft scratch of pencil on paper. She walked into the dining room where Alex sat, his back to her, hunched over his latest creation. The air was thick with the same cold feeling she'd felt the night of the accident. "Alex," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "What are you drawing now?" No answer. Not a word. Not even a glance. Lydia stepped closer, her stomach tightening with unease. This time, she could see the figures taking shape even before she was close enough to look. The figures, dark and haunting, seemed almost to move of their own accord. The pencil danced across the page, its sharp lead biting deep into the paper, etching out jagged shapes and lines. And then she saw it. At the center of the page was the most grotesque image she'd ever seen. It was a figure, twisted and malformed, much like the ones in the other drawings. But this one was different. It was darker. The lines were thicker, the shadows deeper. And its eyes, they weren't just eyes. They were voids, hollow pits, blacker than the deepest night. Lydia felt a cold chill creep up her spine. There was something deeply wrong with that face. It was almost as if it were staring back at her, watching her, its dark eyes pulling her in. She recoiled, feeling a wave of nausea wash over her. "Alex," Lydia said again, more firmly this time. "Where did you get these images?" Still no answer. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to gently take the paper from him. But before she could touch it, Alex snatched it back, his small fingers curling around the edge protectively. He looked up at her then, his gaze intense, almost too intense, as though there was something deep inside him that knew exactly what he was doing. And that, perhaps, was the most chilling thing of all. The boy's lips twitched, but no words came. Lydia pulled her hand back, fighting the urge to shout, to demand answers. But how could she? How could she demand anything from a child who could never give her one? And yet, something deep inside her screamed that this was no ordinary silence. This was something far darker. That night, as she lay in bed next to Dan, Lydia couldn't shake the image from her mind. The figure's hollow eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went, like some malevolent presence lurking just outside her line of vision. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image, but it was no use. It was there, waiting for her in the darkness. She turned toward Dan, hoping to find some comfort in his steady breathing, but the air in the room felt thick, too thick, like it was pressing down on her chest. The walls felt as if they were closing in. The house, which had once felt like a safe haven, now felt suffocating. "I think something's wrong with Alex," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. Dan, ever the pragmatist, stirred but didn't wake. He always had an easy time slipping into sleep, as though nothing in the world could trouble him. But Lydia knew better. She knew that something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones, in the marrow of her very being. The next day, Lydia took Alex to see Dr. Harper, a child psychologist who had worked in the town for years. He had helped countless children through difficult periods, guiding them with patience and care. He was a kind man with a gentle demeanor, but even he seemed taken aback when he met Alex for the first time. Alex sat silently on the couch, his small hands clenched tightly in his lap. His eyes darted around the room, scanning every corner with a level of intensity that made Dr. Harper pause. There was something unnerving about the way the boy seemed to absorb everything in the room. The photographs on the wall, the bookshelves, the soft ticking of the clock on the mantel. "So," Dr. Harper began, his voice calm but cautious. "What do you like to do, Alex?" Alex didn't answer. He didn't even look at him. Lydia shifted in her seat. She could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. It had been 2 years since Alex had stopped speaking, and still no one had any answers. They tried everything except for acknowledging the possibility that there was something far darker at play here. Dr. Harper leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more gentle tone. "Do you like to draw, Alex? I see you're holding a pencil in your hand." Lydia's heart skipped a beat. The drawings. Alex's grip on the pencil tightened, his fingers white against the wood. He didn't speak, but as Dr. Harper continued to try and coax him into some kind of communication, Lydia watched the boy's gaze, his dark, intense gaze, flicker briefly to her. And then it happened. Without warning, Alex dropped the pencil onto the floor. It rolled away, its soft clink echoing in the silence. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The moment the pencil hit the ground, a faint whisper filled the room, so faint that only Lydia heard it. It wasn't a voice she recognized. It was a low, rasping sound, like the wind scraping against a window pane. But there was something else. It was familiar, too familiar. Lydia's eyes widened, her pulse quickening. She turned to look at Alex, but the boy was staring straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face blank. But the whisper continued. It was saying her name. Lydia could feel the hair on the back of her neck rise as the whisper continued, faint but unmistakable, like the rustle of dry leaves in an autumn wind. It was a voice. No, not just a voice. A presence. It felt as though the air itself had thickened, the walls closing in just a little tighter. A low rasping sound, foreign yet unnervingly close. And then, there it was again. Her name. Lydia. Her body went rigid, her eyes wide, heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't her imagination. It couldn't be. The voice was too clear, too deliberate. It was coming from Alex. No, from something beyond him. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry, her fingers tight against the armrest of the chair she sat in. Dr. Harper, still unaware of the sound that only Lydia had heard, leaned forward again, as if trying to get Alex to speak. His calm voice continued, but Lydia couldn't focus. She was no longer in the room. She wasn't even sure where she was. The world had narrowed down to that whisper and Alex's unsettling silence. Her breath hitched in her throat as the sound grew louder. Not much, but enough to press against her sanity. Enough to make her doubt everything she had ever known. The whisper didn't stop. Lydia. 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 Her legs trembled beneath her, a cold sweat breaking out along her forehead. Every muscle in her body felt locked, frozen, but somehow at the same time, as if they were being pulled towards something dark. She shook her head, trying to focus on the present, on the now. This wasn't happening. There was nothing to fear, she told herself. She had to stay grounded. But it wasn't that easy, was it? Alex hadn't moved an inch. His eyes were still fixed on the floor, his expression unreadable. Yet Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow aware of her fear, aware of the darkness that was creeping into her mind. Dr. Harper. Lydia managed to croak out, her voice thin and unsteady. The psychologist glanced up at her, his face drawn with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice warm, but Lydia could hear the edge of confusion in it. She opened her mouth to answer, but found no words would come. She turned to look at Alex, desperate for some sign, some explanation for what was happening. But the boy remained still, as if suspended in time, his silence more oppressive than any sound. He didn't acknowledge her or the doctor. It was as though he was in a world of his own, one that didn't allow her to enter. The whisper continued, swirling around her. Lydia, Lydia, Lydia. Her mind was racing, filled with questions she had no answers for. Had Alex somehow called this darkness into their lives? Was he a conduit for something much worse than she could ever comprehend? And the more she thought about it, the more she understood that the quiet, unnerving whispers weren't just a byproduct of her panic. It was something else, something much deeper. And that something had been there all along, lurking just beyond the boy's silence, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The seconds stretched into infinity as Lydia tried to steady her breath. She had to focus. She had to get out of this trance. She turned her gaze back to Dr. Harper, forcing herself to make eye contact with him. I don't know what's happening, Lydia whispered, her voice shaking. Dr. Harper furrowed his brow and sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He looked at Alex with a kind, though increasingly concerned, gaze. He cleared his throat and spoke slowly, as if trying to figure out his next words carefully. "Lydia, I think we need to approach this systematically. Alex isn't speaking, yes, but that doesn't mean there's nothing going on inside him. Sometimes children express things in ways we can't always recognize. Art, in particular, can be a window into their inner world." But Lydia was no longer listening. Her heart was beating so loudly in her chest, she could barely hear her own thoughts. The whisper, it was louder now, impossibly louder, and she could feel it crawling under her skin, down her spine, digging into her mind. It wasn't just her name anymore. It was calling something else, something she couldn't name. "Lydia, Lydia, listen to me." And then, the sound. From somewhere deep in the walls of the room, from beyond the flimsy drywall, came a creak, a low groan. It was like the house was settling, but not in the usual way. No, this was different. It was more like the house was shifting, stretching its bones, waking up from a long, unnatural slumber. Lydia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor in protest. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice rising, panicked. Dr. Harper looked startled, his eyes darting to the walls. "Hear what?" "The walls," Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. She placed a hand against the cold surface of the nearest wall, feeling the vibrations hum under her fingertips. It was subtle at first, but as she pressed harder, the groaning deepened, stretching from a faint vibration to something that felt almost like a throbbing, something alive. The psychologist rose from his seat. "Lydia, I think you might be—" His words trailed off as he moved toward her, his eyes narrowing. His gaze shifted to Alex, who had not moved. No, not a muscle had twitched, but Lydia could see the faintest hint of a smile playing at the edges of his lips. It was the same twisted smile, the one from his drawings. A sense of foreboding crawled up Lydia's spine. Her mouth went dry, and her heart seemed to stop beating as she realized, too late, what was happening. The whispers, the strange sounds in the walls, the unsettling images Alex had been creating. They were all connected. This wasn't a child's imagination. This wasn't a coincidence. There was something darker at work here, something far more dangerous than she could have ever predicted. And just as the house seemed to tremble with some hidden power, Alex finally broke his silence. Without turning to look at either of them, his voice came, quiet but piercing, through the thick, suffocating air. "It's too late." Lydia felt her blood run cold. The words hung in the air like a death knell, chilling and final. The whisper, the voice in the walls, the drawing of the twisted figure, all of it rushed back to her in a single wave. She could see it now, could see the pattern she hadn't been able to comprehend before. Alex had never been silent. No, not truly. He had been listening. And now, as the dark presence within him stirred, it was ready to speak. The walls of Dr. Harper's office seemed to close in, suffocating Lydia as Alex's words echoed in her ears. "It's too late." The boy's voice, so soft and detached, felt like it was being dragged from some deep, hidden place, like it had been waiting for this moment. Lydia froze, her breath caught in her throat, her body stiff with fear. "It's too late," Alex repeated, his tone unnervingly calm. He didn't move. His eyes remained glued to the floor, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Lydia's heart hammered in her chest. The whisper, the one that had started so quietly and then built into an unrelenting storm, had stopped. In its place was the thick, suffocating silence of the room. It felt wrong, unnatural. The weight of it pressed down on Lydia, forcing her to take a step back. Dr. Harper, who had been looking between Lydia and Alex, now stood completely still. The change in the air was palpable. It wasn't the kind of stillness that brought peace, but one that chilled the very marrow of your bones. He glanced at the walls as if wondering if they were playing tricks on him. "Alex," Dr. Harper said, his voice now strained with concern. "What do you mean, it's too late? What's too late?" The boy didn't answer. He simply stared down at the floor, his hands trembling slightly. Lydia watched him carefully, her mind racing. She could feel something inside her, the instinctive fear that grows when the world becomes wrong, when the rules of reality bend ever so slightly and the air shifts. "I think we need to leave," Lydia said, her voice low and tight, but there was no hesitation in her words. She turned toward the door before Dr. Harper could respond, her hand reaching out to grip the cold handle, desperate to escape whatever was lingering in that room. The door wouldn't open. She pulled at it harder, her fingers slick with sweat, panic creeping into her veins. The handle turned, but the door didn't budge. Lydia's heart beat louder in her chest. She glanced back at Dr. Harper, who was now standing frozen, watching her with wide eyes. Alex's expression, or lack thereof, was unreadable, as if he were detached from the chaos unfolding around him. The air grew thicker, heavier. Something was wrong, not just with Alex, but with the whole room. The walls, the floor, the ceiling. Everything felt like it was slowly being drawn inward, as though the room was somehow alive, breathing, shifting with some hidden malevolence. Lydia's pulse quickened. She tugged at the door once more, with all her strength, but it was as if the door was no longer bound by the laws of physics. She tried to scream for help, but her voice was swallowed up by the thickening atmosphere. It was as if the very house itself had become part of the nightmare. Then, in the distance, through the cracks in the walls, Lydia thought she heard something moving, something alive. It was a low, scraping sound. It seemed to travel from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere. The room shuddered, a faint tremor running through the ground beneath their feet. Lydia felt it in her bones, like an earthquake's warning, though it wasn't loud or violent. No, it was subtle, calculated. It was something waiting, watching. "What's happening?" Lydia whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Dr. Harper didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Alex, who, impossibly, was smiling. A thin, twisted grin that stretched across the boy's face, his lips curling up at the corners in an almost knowing way. It wasn't the innocent smile of a child. No, this was something dark, something malicious. Lydia tried the door again, desperate now, but this time the coldness was unbearable. The door was solid, unyielding, as if it were part of the trap. The walls, the air, everything had been designed to keep them in. Alex's gaze shifted slightly. He looked up, his eyes catching Lydia's, and for the first time since that day he stopped speaking, Lydia saw something in his eyes that made her stomach turn. He knew. There was no fear in Alex's eyes, no recognition of the terror surrounding them. It was as though the boy understood everything, as though he was beyond what was happening. And when he spoke again, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent an ice-cold shiver down Lydia's spine. "It's already inside. It's already here." The words were hollow, as though they came from some far-off place, some distant shadow that clung to the boy's soul. Lydia's mind whirled. She was sure now that there was something darker at work here, something far more malevolent than she had imagined. It had been inside Alex all along, waiting, watching, and now it was ready to emerge. "Alex, what is this?" Lydia demanded, her voice breaking. She reached out for him, but her hand trembled. The room, the space between them, felt like it was growing, stretching, becoming impossibly vast. The boy didn't answer. He simply stared at her, his eyes darkening with every passing second. His small hands, those same hands that had drawn the twisted, terrible images, clenched into fists. And then the walls groaned. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a cry, a deep, guttural noise that came from the very bones of the house, a sound so ancient that it felt as if the house itself was alive. The ground beneath Lydia's feet shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but it wasn't just the house groaning. It was something within the house, something that hadn't been there before. Lydia stumbled back, pressing herself against the door. Her breath came in short gasps. She was sure she could feel something, the presence, pushing against the walls from the inside. Something ancient and evil that had been sealed within the house. Alex had been the key. The drawings were just the beginning, the whispering. It was a call, a summons. The house had been waiting for Alex. It had been waiting for the moment when he would finally open the door. And now that moment had come. Before she could react, before she could process what was happening, the walls trembled once more. This time, the entire house seemed to shake, as if the earth itself had cracked open. The groaning sound was louder now, almost deafening, and through the cracks in the walls, Lydia could see something. A flicker of movement in the shadows. A figure, tall, dark, unhuman. Lydia's pulse raced. Her mind screamed for her to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The door would not open. The walls would not budge. The room was closing in on her, as if it were alive, breathing, and it was hungry. Then, as if on cue, the air around them grew colder, freezing. Lydia could see her breath misting in the air. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was the presence. It was choking the life from the room. Alex raised his eyes to the ceiling, his grin widening as the figure in the shadows moved toward him. "It's here," Alex whispered, his voice a perfect match for the darkness creeping closer. And the house, now alive with a pulse of its own, finally answered. Lydia's heart stopped, then thundered again, so loud she thought Dr. Harper might hear it in his chest. The shadow moved. No, it slithered across the room. It was impossible to describe, a silhouette that bled into the darkness, a distortion in the air itself, a thing born from nightmares. She could feel it, that cold pressure, like icy fingers caressing the very spine of the house, creeping across the floor toward them. It was alive, but it was more than alive. It was ancient, older than the house, older than the earth itself. The whisper had come again. Lydia. Only now, it wasn't in the walls. It was coming from Alex, but his lips didn't move. The words, however, were as clear as the sound of a bell, tolling in a dead town. The kind of bell that rings, not for a funeral, but for the moment the world is about to collapse. And Alex, God, his face twisted into that grin again. He wasn't a child anymore. He wasn't even human. He was a vessel, a door, and the darkness, the thing that had been waiting so long, had finally found its way through. Lydia stumbled back, her hand scraping across the door handle once more, her chest tight, desperate to escape, to wake up. But there was no waking up from this. No dream to shatter. This was real. This was far too real. "You have to run," Lydia whispered, barely more than a breath. She glanced at Dr. Harper. His eyes were locked on Alex, and there was something almost lost in his expression. He didn't move, didn't speak. He was transfixed, caught in the same web Lydia was, wrapped tight in the horror that now enveloped them both. He had heard the whisper, seen the shadow move. His mind must have been trying to piece it all together, to rationalize it, but there was no logic left in the room. Dr. Harper didn't respond, his mouth agape, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't even flinched when the shadow had moved. He was no longer concerned with Alex's silence. He had long since abandoned the therapeutic mantra, the safe, sanitized world of psychology, in favor of something much darker, something older. Lydia turned back to Alex, her fingers trembling as she reached out to him. She could see the figure now, fully, clearly, if only for a second. It was an outline of a man, but the edges were wrong, jagged, as though reality itself had been hacked apart and reassembled. It loomed over Alex, whose grin had stretched impossibly wider. His eyes were vacant, but they held a depth that made Lydia's stomach churn. It was as if he was looking, no, seeing, the thing before him, something that only he could comprehend. The shadow bent down low, inches from Alex's face. Its form shifted, flowing like dark smoke that was caught in a stiff wind. It whispered, but not in the way it had before. Now the whisper felt like a command, and it wasn't just in Lydia's ears. It was inside her mind. "You will not leave this place. It is too late for escape." She shook her head violently, desperate to break free of the grip the shadow had on her. "Number, I won't let this happen." But the voice only deepened, became darker, more solid. The shadow moved, its form twisting, shifting, and Lydia caught a glimpse of its true nature. It wasn't just dark. It was a part of the house, a part of the land, perhaps. The land that had been here long before anyone else. Its essence ran through the foundation of the very earth. It was never meant to leave, but here it was, breaking through in this space, in Alex's body, in his silence. The smile on Alex's face stretched even further, his lips cracking, bleeding black, like ink spilling from the wounds of his mouth. "No," Lydia whispered, her knees giving out beneath her. She crumpled to the floor, her breath shallow and erratic. It was too much to comprehend. The whisper had shifted again. "Lydia, don't you understand? You are already ours." The words punched into Lydia's skull. She gasped for air, struggling against the growing pressure in her chest. The presence in the room had become overwhelming. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in her veins. She felt it, like cold fingers gripping her heart, squeezing until it could hardly beat. And then, through the suffocating darkness, the figure spoke. A low, guttural rasp that was barely a whisper, but it was enough to rattle her bones. It wasn't Alex's voice. No, it was something far older, far more terrible. Your silence was the key. Lydia couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't move. The room tilted. The floor buckled under her, as if it were no longer solid. And then she saw it. A single dark shape, a massive figure towering over her. But it wasn't a man. No, it was far too large. Its form was formless, yet alive, moving with purpose. The eyes, it had eyes, were pools of ink, endless and deep. And the price it demanded was a price Lydia knew all too well. Alex had opened the door, but it was Lydia who had failed to see the warning. She had been running from the truth, unwilling to look deeper into the drawings, the words, the silence. And now, that price had come for her. But the presence didn't move toward her. No, it lingered near Alex, who now stood up slowly, his body jerking as though it were not his own. He was a marionette. Lydia's throat tightened as the house around them creaked and groaned, the walls bending in ways that no house should ever bend. The thing, the shadow, had taken hold of Alex, but it needed more. It needed them all. Lydia could feel it, a pull deep in her chest. She had to act. She had to do something. "Alex," she managed to croak, her voice strangled with fear. She reached toward him, but her hand trembled, barely able to catch her breath. The boy didn't move, didn't respond. He was no longer the Alex she had tried to reach. The presence surged forward, filling the room with the weight of its malevolence. And Lydia understood at last that it wasn't just Alex who was trapped. It was the house, the land, everything that had ever touched that darkness. It had been waiting. It had always been waiting. And Lydia was about to pay the price for their silence. The whisper came again, and this time Lydia understood. "It's too late, Lydia. Too late for you to run." The last thing Lydia heard before the darkness claimed her was the echo of Alex's laugh, soft, hollow, and filled with malice. And then, nothing. The sky hung low, a blanket of gray that pressed down on the small town like a weight too heavy to bear. Jonathan stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching as the mourners shuffled away, their footsteps heavy and their faces ashen. The funeral had been brief, as funerals tend to be when the person being mourned is little more than a stranger. It had been a mistake, he realized now, attending this service, this final goodbye, to someone he had never really known. But there had been something about the invitation that had tugged at him, something about the name on the card that had stuck in his mind, like a splinter lodged in his skin. The deceased man's name was Arthur Finch, and Jonathan had met him only once, years ago. He hadn't been close with him, not in any real sense, but there had been an odd connection between them, an unspoken understanding that Jonathan had never quite been able to place. Arthur had been a quiet man, the kind that blends into the background of life, unnoticed by most. But Jonathan had always noticed him. Perhaps it was because of the stories, the strange rumors that had surrounded Arthur's life, the ones that whispered of hidden debts, mysterious encounters, and the lingering suspicion that something had been wrong in the quiet corners of Arthur's life. Jonathan had never asked, never inquired, but the mystery had followed him, clinging to him like dust on an old coat. Now, with the funeral over and the sky dimming into evening, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was a gnawing sensation, like a splinter working its way deeper under his skin. He had never been one for superstition, for believing in ghosts or spirits. He wasn't a man of faith, nor was he one for fanciful thoughts. Yet, as he walked slowly back to his car, the air around him seemed to change. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the chill of the evening creeping in. No, it was something else. A presence, a feeling. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Jonathan turned his head quickly, looking over his shoulder, but there was no one there. The cemetery was empty now, save for the workers finishing their task of filling in the grave. But it wasn't the sight of someone that had made him feel uneasy. It was the sense of it, the sensation of being watched, as if there were eyes on him, unseen and unfelt, lurking just out of sight. He shook his head. He was being ridiculous. There was nothing here but the wind and the fading daylight. Nothing more. Yet, as he climbed into his car and started the engine, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. It followed him like a shadow. Driving through the winding streets of the town, Jonathan tried to shake off the sensation, to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But it wasn't so easy. The further he drove, the more the feeling intensified. It was as if someone was behind him, just out of sight, breathing down his neck. He checked the rearview mirror. Empty. The road stretched behind him, dark and empty, just as it should be. But still, that nagging feeling lingered. A breath. The air inside the car grew warmer, almost suffocating. It was subtle at first, just a slight difference in temperature, but it was enough to make Jonathan uneasy. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, but the feeling refused to let go. It wasn't the car's heater. It wasn't the humidity in the air. It was something else, something deeper and more unsettling. And then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the breath came again. It was faint at first, a soft, almost imperceptible whoosh of air that brushed against the back of his neck. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He knew it wasn't his imagination. He knew what it was. Someone was standing behind him. He spun around in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, but the back seat was empty. The interior of the car was just as it should be, nothing out of place. The air was cool, normal, nothing like the warmth he'd felt moments before. But the feeling didn't go away. It hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing in from every direction. Jonathan wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, the sweat starting to beat up despite the cool evening air. His breath came in shallow bursts as he looked around, his mind racing, trying to find some rational explanation for the sensation he was experiencing. But there was no explanation. He was alone. He had to be. There was no one else in the car, no one else on the road. The town was still and quiet, the streetlights flickering to life as he passed under them. And yet, it felt as though he wasn't alone, as though something or someone was right there with him, watching him, waiting for him. The breath came again. This time, it was harder to ignore, louder, closer. It was as if someone was standing just behind him, their mouth inches from his ear, their breath hot and insistent, curling around his neck like a whisper of death. Jonathan's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. His breath hitched in his throat, and he forced himself to focus on the road, willing the sensation away. He couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Not like this. But the longer he drove, the stronger the feeling became. It was as though the breath had followed him from the cemetery, a ghostly presence that refused to leave. It was no longer confined to the back of his neck. It moved with him, a shadow that stretched across the car, the air thickening as if someone, something, was pressing in from all sides. And then, as if to confirm the horror that had begun to creep into his mind, the voice came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even a whisper. But Jonathan heard it clear as day. The voice was cold, like the breath of someone who had been dead for far too long. I'm not done yet. Jonathan's blood ran cold. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and for a moment he thought he might faint. his vision blurred, his heart thundering in his chest. Who? What? Was that? It wasn't possible. He had to be hearing things. His mind was playing tricks on him, dragging him into a place he couldn't understand. But the words, cold and dark, echoed in his mind like a death knell. And then, as if to punctuate the terror, the breath came again. Closer this time, much closer, almost as if the unseen presence was just inches away from him, breathing down his neck. Jonathan slammed his foot on the gas, speeding up as the town rushed past him. His mind raced. He had to get home. He had to get away. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he pushed the car, the breath never stopped. It followed him, relentless. And the voice, it followed that too. I'm not done yet. The words were a promise, and Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just meant for him. They were meant for someone else, someone who had already died, someone who had been buried in the ground, but whose presence was still here, still lingering. And that presence, it wasn't finished yet. The dead man's breath had just begun. Jonathan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. The night outside had turned pitch black. The headlights of his car cutting through the darkness like the thin edge of a knife. His heart beat wildly, the blood in his veins suddenly ice cold. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again, not after hearing that voice. I'm not done yet. The words haunted him, curling around his mind like smoke, slipping into his thoughts when he least expected it. The breath had followed him from the cemetery, and now it was here, just inches away, whispering behind him in the suffocating silence of the car. But he couldn't be losing his mind. Number. He had to be strong. He had to think. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The sensation, no, the presence, had to be some kind of trick. Maybe it was his nerves, the funeral, the long drive, the lingering unease from the strange man he barely knew, Arthur Finch. Perhaps it was something psychological. That was the explanation. There was no ghost. There was no dead man's breath. But then came the voice again, low and guttural, like it had been waiting for him to fall into the trap, to start doubting himself. I'm not done yet. Jonathan's throat tightened as the words reverberated in his skull. His hands shook so violently now that he had trouble keeping the car steady on the winding road. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but it was useless. The breath was there, invisible but undeniable, a presence pressing in on him from the darkness, a dead weight that hung over his shoulders, whispering through the static of his mind. The air was stifling. He flicked on the car's AC, trying to break the thick heat that seemed to cling to him, but it didn't work. The heat remained, heavy and suffocating. He couldn't escape it. The breath was still there, like it was in the very air around him, hovering just at the edge of his consciousness. I'm not done yet. The words slipped into the cracks of his thoughts, like liquid filling a crack in a glass, pooling in the back of his mind. He couldn't escape them. They had become a part of him, a mark he couldn't erase. He needed to get out. He needed to escape the feeling that someone was there, someone who shouldn't be. But where could he go? The town was far behind him, and the winding road ahead led nowhere but further into the vast, empty wilderness. A sigh escaped Jonathan's lips as he pushed the gas pedal harder, his foot aching from the pressure. The faster he went, the further he tried to escape, But the breath, the voice, seemed to be keeping pace, like a shadow that mirrored every move. No matter how fast he drove, no matter how much he tried to outrun it, it followed. It never left. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, his eyes widening when he saw what appeared to be a figure standing behind him, though it lasted only a moment. He blinked, but the figure was gone, leaving only the empty seat behind him. Jonathan's chest tightened, and his breath came in ragged bursts. He slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. "Get it together, damn it," he muttered under his breath. He was losing his grip on reality, spiraling deeper into madness. He needed to stop, to breathe. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching under the tires as he parked. The engine's hum was the only sound that filled the silence, and for a brief moment, the world around him felt still. He reached for the door handle, but paused before opening it. The air outside was cold, but not in the usual way. This cold was different. It was sharp, biting, like something was waiting just beyond the car door. "Don't open it." The thought slammed into his mind so suddenly that it left him paralyzed. He couldn't explain why, but there was a deep, gut-wrenching feeling that if he stepped out of the car, if he opened that door to the outside world, he would be stepping straight into the grasp of something wrong, something dead. The breath was closer now, no longer in his imagination. It had crossed the line from mere suggestion to undeniable fact. It was real. It was here. He pulled at the seatbelt, his breath coming faster, heart racing again. The dark outside the car was like a wall, impenetrable, suffocating. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the wind. The wind doesn't breathe like that. Wind doesn't press against you, doesn't linger on your skin like a second unwanted presence. "I'm not done yet." The words whispered again, slow and deliberate this time. They crawled through the air and into his ears like a snake, slithering beneath his skin. He didn't know why he thought it, but he knew who was speaking. Arthur Finch. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't thought about Arthur in years. Why was he suddenly so present in his thoughts? It didn't make sense. He hadn't known Arthur well. In fact, he'd barely known him at all. But there was that one meeting, the one where they'd stood at the corner of a street in town, speaking about some old, trivial thing. A passing conversation, a quick smile, nothing extraordinary. And yet, since the funeral, since the moment he'd stepped into the graveyard, it was as if Arthur Finch had never truly left, as if somehow he had always been there, just outside Jonathan's peripheral vision, watching him, waiting. That sense of being watched hadn't been new. Jonathan had felt it long before today, before the funeral. He'd felt it every time he walked down a dark hallway, every time he turned a corner in the night. But now it had a name, and that name was Arthur Finch. The air in the car grew heavier, and Jonathan's breath grew shallow as he fought the urge to panic. There was a presence in the car now, a pressure that filled the space, squeezing the life out of the room. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror again, and this time he didn't blink. He saw it, Arthur Finch, or at least something that looked like him, a figure, faint and hazy, shrouded in the dark, standing just behind his seat. Its eyes glimmered in the reflection, a deep, unblinking black. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. No, this is not real. But the figure didn't disappear. It lingered. It was there, watching, breathing. He couldn't breathe. He slammed the door open and jumped out of the car, falling to his knees in the gravel. The cold night air hit his face like a slap, but it wasn't enough to break the fog that had settled in his brain. He needed to run. He needed to get away from this thing, but his feet wouldn't move. And then, from the darkness, came the breath again, louder, closer, a heavy, ragged sound that cut through the night like a blade. It was real. It was coming for him. Jonathan stumbled to his feet, his body trembling with fear, and he knew, with sickening clarity, that he could never escape it. The dead man's breath would follow him forever. Jonathan's feet, still tangled in the gravel, finally gave in to the terror, propelling him forward in a stumbling, disjointed run. The world around him seemed to twist, to stretch like a funhouse mirror, every shadow bending and reaching toward him. Every corner of the road an invitation for something unseen to grab hold of him. The air, cold and sharp, pressed down on him like a vice. But the breath, the foul, rotten breath of something dead, still lingered at his back. It was worse now, suffocating in its insistence, clawing at the back of his neck like invisible hands. Arthur Finch, Jonathan thought, the name like a mantra, his heart slamming harder against his ribs. His mind reeled, trying desperately to grasp at any fragments of reason. Arthur Finch had been buried in the ground. He couldn't be here. Not now. Not like this. Jonathan had seen the man lowered into the earth. He had watched the earth close over him. Arthur Finch was dead, and there was no way a dead man could follow him out here, could breathe behind him, could whisper into his ear as though they were still alive. But there was no escaping it, no running. The breath was real. He could feel it, warm and damp against the back of his neck, the tickling sensation crawling under his skin. His body had become a battlefield, his mind wrestling against the panic, struggling to rationalize what was happening. Jonathan staggered, his legs giving way beneath him. His knees hit the ground, rough and unforgiving, as the breath hit him again. Hot, foul breath, steady like a pulse. He couldn't see it. He couldn't see the thing behind him. He turned, gasping for air, expecting to find the cemetery still behind him, expecting to see nothing but a stretch of empty, desolate road. But the darkness, it wasn't the same darkness he had left behind in the car. This darkness felt different. It felt alive. The shadows themselves seemed to curl inward, like hungry mouths eager to devour him. For a moment, he thought he saw something in the depths of the dark, a figure, indistinct, like smoke, barely there. But the moment his eyes focused on it, the figure vanished, swallowed by the abyss. Jonathan shook his head, trying to clear the vision from his mind. It's not real. It's just fear. It's just my mind breaking. I'm not going insane. I'm not. But it wasn't enough. A sound reached his ears, distant at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Someone was walking behind him. Slow, deliberate, methodical steps that carried no weight, no echo. Just a soft tread that seemed to inch closer with each passing second. He forced himself to his feet, his heart pounding in his throat. His legs were weak, his body trembling, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let whatever was following him get closer. He couldn't be alone out here, not with this thing, not with whatever had followed him from the grave. He didn't dare look back, knowing that if he did, he'd see it. He'd see those eyes, the ones that had glimmered in the rearview mirror, staring at him from the darkness. He couldn't look. He knew it, with every fiber of his being. He couldn't see it. Not again. The footsteps came closer. Steady, unyielding. The voice whispered again. Low, cold, and familiar. I'm not done yet. It was a low hiss, like the wind carrying the dead man's final breath. It clawed at Jonathan's insides, chilled his blood, made his skin crawl. He felt it now, not just the breath, but the presence. It was no longer behind him, but inside him, like it had seeped under his skin, pooling in his bones. Jonathan moved faster, his breath ragged, his steps uneven. He didn't know where he was running. He didn't know if he was running toward safety or further into the unknown. The road stretched endlessly before him, an unbroken line of darkness, and he couldn't remember when it had become so desolate. Suddenly, the gravel road gave way to a thick patch of trees, towering over him like silent sentinels. The branches twisted together, forming an impenetrable wall of shadow. The path ahead narrowed into a small, claustrophobic tunnel, the darkness pressing in on him, making it harder to breathe. Go through it, he told himself. You have to. There's nowhere else to go. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The voice, Arthur Finch's voice, rang in his ears again, louder this time, sharp like a blade slicing through the silence. You can't escape. The words were so clear, so real, that Jonathan felt as if the world had fallen away entirely. There was no sound in the woods now, nothing but his own breathing, frantic and shallow. The footsteps, too, had stopped, but that didn't make him feel better. It only made the air thicker, heavier, as if the silence were about to suffocate him. He tried to listen, tried to make sense of the soundless night. Nothing at all. And then he heard it, the whisper again. Only this time, it wasn't in his ear. It wasn't behind him. It was inside his head. I'm not done yet. Jonathan froze. The words didn't come from the world around him. They came from inside, from the very center of his mind, like a needle driving through his skull. It was unbearable. His hands flew to his head, as though trying to pry the words out of his brain. But it was too late. They had settled deep inside him, burrowing like a parasite, feeding off his fear, turning him into something unrecognizable. His eyes darted around the trees, as if looking for someone, something that could help him make sense of this nightmare. But there was no one. There was only the darkness and the breath that was still there, still watching. Jonathan's legs gave way again, and this time he didn't fight it. He collapsed to the forest floor, his body shaking as though it were trying to reject whatever force was inside him, whatever was pushing him to the edge of his sanity. And then, as if the darkness itself had chosen to move, he heard a sound, a twig snapping behind him. He spun around, his heart racing, every muscle in his body screaming for him to run. But when he looked behind him, when he turned to face whatever it was, there was nothing there, nothing at all. And yet the air around him, the breath, it grew colder, heavier. The dead man's breath wasn't done yet. Jonathan could feel the cold ground beneath him, the sharp sting of twigs and rocks pressing into his palms as he pushed himself up. His breath came in ragged, desperate gasps, but it was no use. The night was swallowing him whole, pulling him deeper into its suffocating embrace. The weight of it all, of the breath, of the voice, of the thing behind him, was crushing, like a phantom hand, squeezing the life from his chest. He tried to stand, his legs shaking, refusing to obey his command. He stumbled forward, his body uncoordinated, but he couldn't stop. His eyes darted around, scanning the darkness for some sign, some hint of reality. But all he saw were the trees. So many trees, stretching like a forest of ghosts, their branches twisted and gnarled, like skeletal hands reaching out to him, yearning to pull him further into their grasp. The breath came again, louder this time, steady, persistent, warm. "I'm not done yet." The words slithered through the air like a venomous serpent, curling around his mind, sinking into his skull like a weight, dragging him down. The breath was closer now, too close. He could feel the heat of it, brushing against the back of his neck, a presence that hung over him like a shadow waiting to swallow him whole. Jonathan's heart slammed against his ribs, the pulse in his throat so loud it drowned out all other sound. He turned quickly, expecting to find the dark figure behind him again, its hollow eyes staring into his soul, its form a specter of death. But there was nothing, only darkness, only the eerie quiet of the woods. Still the breath remained, a constant reminder that whatever this was, this presence, it wasn't done with him. Not yet. It wouldn't let him go. He backed away, his feet sliding on the uneven ground, his heart pounding so loudly it made his ears ring. He could feel the trees closing in on him, the forest becoming more like a cage than a sanctuary. The breath was too close now. He could feel it in the air, stirring it, like a presence so thick it was almost tangible. "I'm not done yet." Jonathan's chest constricted, his lungs burning, his throat tight with panic. He needed to get out of the woods. He needed to escape whatever was stalking him. But how? Where? There was no path, no direction, just a maze of trees in an endless expanse of dark. His mind raced, trying to find some way to make sense of the madness. The breath, the voice. Arthur Finch. Was this his doing? Was this man, dead and buried, somehow still reaching for him, still dragging him into the shadows? The idea seemed impossible, absurd. But the more Jonathan thought about it, the more it made sense. There was something in the cemetery, something buried with Arthur Finch. He had felt it that day, had felt it as he stood over the grave. A strange unease, a gnawing feeling, something that wouldn't let go. It was like the ground itself was alive, pulsing with energy, but he hadn't understood it then. He hadn't known. Now, though, now it was clear. Whatever had been buried with Finch, it hadn't stayed buried. It had followed Jonathan from that graveyard, following him with a relentless purpose, like it was after something, after him. Jonathan's mind spun. There was no time to think, no time to analyze the impossible. His hands, slick with sweat, fumbled for the flashlight in his pocket. He pulled it out in desperation, flicking the switch, but the beam of light barely cut through the dense blackness of the woods. The trees seemed to absorb the light, devouring it, leaving only shadows behind. "I'm not done yet." The voice repeated the words, this time louder, as though the very air around Jonathan had become a vessel for it, an amplifier for the dead man's will. He could almost hear the sound of breath, hot, fetid breath, panting in his ear. It was so close now, closer than it had ever been, and Jonathan knew with sickening certainty that if he turned around, if he looked, he would find it there, standing behind him, waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed in the forest, but this time they were different. They were heavier, more deliberate, as if whatever was stalking him had grown tired of merely following, had grown impatient. Jonathan's pulse quickened, the blood rushing in his ears like thunder. "I'm not done yet." Jonathan couldn't stop himself. He turned around, spinning on his heel. His breath caught in his chest. The light from the flashlight flared briefly in the darkness, illuminating nothing. There was nothing there. No figure, no shadow. But then, a gust of wind blew through the trees, sharp and biting, as if something had passed through the forest, something heavy, something alive in a way that the wind never was. Jonathan stumbled back, his knees buckling under him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself, but the force of it was too much. He fell to the ground again, this time on his back, his eyes wide as he stared up at the canopy above. The trees seemed to close in over him like a coffin lid, blocking out the sky. And then he heard it, not in the air, but in the ground beneath him, a low, growling noise, like something deep within the earth was stirring. The ground shifted beneath him, a tremor of movement that made his stomach turn. His body was rigid with fear, every muscle tensed, but he couldn't move. He couldn't even scream. The growling turned into a hiss, then a whisper, a voice, but not Arthur Finch's, a voice beneath him. "I'm not done yet." Jonathan's eyes snapped shut, his hands pressed over his ears, as though trying to block out the voice. But it was inside him now. It was inside his very thoughts. It was all around him. The breath, the dead man's breath. The trees began to creak, as though they, too, were alive. The air grew thick with something foul, an unbearable suffocating stench that made Jonathan gag, made him choke. The shadows seemed to reach for him, curling into the spaces between the trees, closing in on him, trapping him in the center of the forest. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the dead man's breath. It wasn't just the whispers. Something else was moving in the dark, something worse, something that was feeding on Jonathan's fear. His pulse raced, his hands trembled as he scrambled to get to his feet, but it was too late. The shadows had already closed in around him, and the air had grown so thick that he couldn't breathe. It pressed against his chest, suffocating, stifling. The dark was alive, and it was hungry. The air was heavy, stifling. It wrapped around Jonathan, tightening like a noose, squeezing out the last remnants of breath he had left. The ground beneath him felt softer now, almost like it was shifting beneath his weight, pulling him in, dragging him closer to the abyss. He could feel it. It, all around him, suffocating him with its presence. The trees loomed like towering sentinels, their branches heavy with the weight of something unseen, something that wasn't quite part of this world. The shadows danced in the corners of his vision, moving as though they were alive, and Jonathan knew, he knew, that something terrible was coming, something far worse than the breath at his back, far worse than the voice whispering in his ears. He had to move. He had to run. His feet, however, wouldn't listen. His legs shook uncontrollably, as though they too had been consumed by the terror that gripped his heart. Every part of him screamed for escape, but his body refused to obey. The darkness was suffocating him, wrapping him in its cold embrace, keeping him grounded, a prisoner of his own fear. Then the ground shifted again, but this time it wasn't just a tremor. It was a ripple, like something moving beneath the earth. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, his eyes wide with fear, as the forest seemed to lean in closer, the trees bending toward him as though they were watching him, waiting for something. The whisper came again, colder now, as if it had crawled from deep within the earth. "You can't run. Not from me." It was the voice, unmistakable, but it wasn't just any voice. It was Arthur Finch's voice, But it wasn't. It was deeper, more primal, more ancient. Something that wasn't just a dead man's spirit anymore. Something worse. Jonathan's stomach twisted, and a surge of panic flooded his chest. His breath came in shallow, desperate gasps as he finally managed to force himself to his feet, stumbling to the side, dragging his body through the thick underbrush, the branches slashing at his face, tearing at his clothes, as if the forest itself was trying to keep him from leaving. The breath, the dead man's breath, it had changed. It was no longer hot, no longer suffocating with the warmth of a body, a living presence. Now it was cold, freezing, the kind of cold that seeped deep into your bones, that clawed at your very soul. It felt like death itself, like the breath of something not quite human, a thing from the dark, a thing that had no name, something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, waiting for its time to finally claim what it was owed. Jonathan could feel it now, in every step he took, in every breath he struggled to pull into his chest. The darkness was crawling beneath his skin. He could feel the weight of it, the dead man's curse pressing against his heart, pulling him deeper into the forest. The cracking sound echoed through the trees. Jonathan froze, his body locked in place, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound wasn't distant. It was close, too close. The ground beneath him shifted again, and Jonathan's eyes darted around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. No movement. Nothing but the silence. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow. A figure, moving swiftly between the trees. It was a shape. No, not a shape. A presence. Something that didn't belong in the natural world. Something that shouldn't be there. Jonathan's blood ran cold, and he found himself stepping backward, stumbling toward the clearing. He tried to turn, tried to escape, but he knew. He knew that whatever this was, it wasn't just the dead man's breath. It was something else. It was something hungry, something that had followed him from the grave, something that had been waiting for him to come to this very moment, to the breaking point where the dead and the living collided. The air around him shifted again, and in the split second before he could react, he saw it. The face. It was there, just beyond the darkness, in the shadows of the trees. A face, a pale, gaunt thing, emerged from the blackness. It was a face Jonathan recognized, but not. It was the face of Arthur Finch, but twisted, decayed, and wrong. The eyes were wide, black pools of nothing, hollowed out sockets where life had once been, and in the mouth, still open, was a breath. The same breath. A cold, dead breath. Jonathan's stomach churned violently. His throat clenched, and the overwhelming scent of rot filled his nostrils. His knees buckled under him, and he collapsed to the ground. A scream caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe, not because of the suffocating air, but because of the thing before him, the thing that wasn't just breathing, but waiting. "You came to me," the thing whispered, its voice no longer a hiss, but a rasping growl, like something pulled from the bowels of the earth itself. Jonathan's heart slammed painfully against his ribs, his pulse racing with an intensity that threatened to rip him apart. His eyes darted around, desperate for a way out, but the woods had changed. The trees were too thick, the air too heavy, the darkness too thick. It was over. The dead man's breath had finally caught up with him. The face of Arthur Finch, or whatever it had become, loomed closer. The air around Jonathan grew colder, impossibly so, until his breath came in clouds of mist that instantly froze in front of him. His chest tightened, his ribs aching under the weight of something terrible, something that had waited long enough. The breath, it was all around him now, close enough to taste. Jonathan felt himself being pulled into it, his body trembling, his soul fighting for an escape. But the more he struggled, the more the darkness closed in. It wrapped itself around him, suffocating until he couldn't move. He couldn't speak. And then, as the final wave of cold hit him, as the last remnants of breath left his body, there was only one thing left: silence, and the weight of the dark. The sun hung low in the sky, just brushing the peaks of the distant mountains, casting long shadows that stretched across the thick, sprawling forest. It was the kind of light that made everything feel just a little too still, a little too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Simon could feel it, the weight of the stillness pressing in on him. It had started that morning when they'd made their way up the narrow trail, the one that nobody but the locals seemed to know. It was supposed to be an adventure, a hike through the woods, a trip to a mysterious stone circle that, according to the guidebook, had been standing for centuries, long before the settlers arrived. The stones, weathered and ancient, were rumored to hold some kind of power, some kind of connection to something otherworldly. But none of that was why Simon was here. He was here because he needed something to get his mind off things. His job, his life, everything felt like it was suffocating him. And this little trip with friends was supposed to be the breath of fresh air he needed. It was supposed to be nothing more than a weekend of hiking, some jokes by the campfire, and a few drinks before heading back to reality. But now, standing at the edge of the stone circle, Simon wasn't so sure anymore. There was something about this place, something that felt off in a way he couldn't quite explain. His skin prickled, a subtle unease curling in his stomach. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" he muttered to himself, his breath misting in the cool air. He turned to look at his friends, who were gathered around the stone circle, fiddling with their backpacks and talking about setting up camp. They were laughing, unaware of the way the atmosphere had changed, the heavy silence that seemed to suffocate the space between the stones. There was Grace, always the life of the group, her dark hair tied back in a messy ponytail, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she examined the runes carved into one of the stones. And then there was Michael, taller than the rest of them, a skeptical look on his face as he tried to make sense of the history that had been laid out for them. Lastly, there was Isabel, quieter than the others, her pale face hidden behind a curtain of blonde hair as she stared at the ground, the air around her thick with something Simon couldn't place. "Everything's fine, Simon," Grace called out, as if reading his mind. "You're just getting in your own head again. It's a damn stone circle, not a haunted house." Simon forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sure. Just feels weird here," Michael chuckled, clapping him on the back. "It's probably just all those legends. People are always making up spooky stories about places like this." But Simon couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The stones, arranged in a perfect circle, stood taller than he expected. The largest of them seemed to loom over the others, its surface smooth and unmarked, as though time had no effect on it. The runes carved into the stones were so worn that they were barely visible, like they'd been etched there eons ago, by hands long forgotten. Yet despite the wear, the markings seemed alive, shifting in the fading light. He was about to turn away, to rejoin the others, when he noticed something strange. A slight movement, or what seemed to be a movement, near the base of one of the stones. His breath hitched. For a second, he thought he saw a figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, standing just behind one of the stones, as if watching them. "Everything okay?" Isabel's voice broke through his thoughts, her soft voice startling him. She was standing beside him now, her pale face drawn with concern. She, too, had noticed a strange air about the place, though she hadn't spoken about it yet. "Yeah, just—" Simon stopped, his eyes scanning the stones again. There was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the same cold stone circle. He felt foolish for letting his imagination run wild. He shook his head. "Nothing. I'm just tired." Isabel didn't seem convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she gave him a small, knowing smile and nodded toward the others. "Let's get the camp set up before it gets too dark." "Yeah," Simon muttered, following her back toward the others. But he couldn't shake the feeling. That feeling of being watched. It gnawed at the back of his mind, gnawing like a rat nibbling at a scrap of bread. As they worked, the light continued to fade, the shadows creeping in faster now, as though they were alive, stretching out over the land like fingers, reaching for something. The stone circle was now a dark, imposing presence, towering in the center of the clearing. And the air had changed. It had become thick, almost suffocating, like the trees had drawn in closer, like the forest was pulling them in, trapping them in its web. "All right, camp set," Michael called out, his voice breaking the tension that had settled over the group. But even his words couldn't push the feeling away. There was something about this place, something wrong. Simon glanced around at his friends, their faces lit by the flickering glow of the campfire they'd just built. Their laughter, their smiles, it all seemed so far away. He couldn't focus on it, couldn't shake the cold grip of dread creeping down his spine. Isabel sat quietly by the fire, her eyes fixed on the stones. The flames flickered, casting long, ghostly shadows over her face. Simon tried to look away, but his gaze kept drifting back to the stone circle. Something in his gut told him they were in more danger than they realized. Grace stood and stretched, yawning. "I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready for some food." She walked toward her pack, oblivious to the strange tension that had settled over the group. Michael grinned, shaking his head. "You're always hungry." But Simon wasn't laughing. He wasn't even looking at Grace anymore. His eyes were locked on the stones, on that one massive stone in the center. It seemed to be watching him, pulling him in, and suddenly he couldn't breathe. And then, almost imperceptibly, the wind began to pick up. It wasn't a gust, no sudden howling wind. It was a soft breath, a whisper in the trees, and with it came a sound, a voice, low and almost inaudible, as if it were carried on the wind itself. Simon froze. His heart stopped in his chest. He couldn't hear it clearly at first, just the rumble of whispers, too faint to understand. But then, just as his chest tightened with panic, the words became clear. "Join us." The voice was cold, hollow, and it wasn't the wind. He turned to Isabel, but she didn't seem to hear it. Grace and Michael were still laughing, oblivious. The fire crackled, the flames reaching up toward the dark sky. But Simon's eyes were wide, locked on the stone circle. The voice came again, louder this time, the whispers growing stronger, as if the stones themselves were speaking. Join us, or stay, forever. Simon felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. The trees had grown closer. The light had not faded properly, and now it felt like they were trapped. The stone circle wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves with a whisper that seemed to carry a message only Simon could hear. He stood frozen, staring at the stone circle, as though it held the answer to every question that had been lingering in the air since they first stepped foot in the woods. It wasn't just the words that had haunted him, though. Join us, or stay forever. It was the weight behind them, the coldness in the air that had settled in his bones, the way everything seemed off. He wasn't sure if it was the setting sun or the way the forest seemed to close in on them, but something had changed. The darkness wasn't just creeping across the land. It was pulling them in, dragging them toward the circle, toward whatever ancient power lay hidden in those stones. He glanced over at Grace and Michael, who were still laughing and fooling around by the campfire, their conversation light-hearted and carefree. Isabel sat a little further away, her back to the fire, her face hidden in the shadows of her hair. But Simon didn't notice any of it, not truly. His mind was too far gone, too wrapped in the whispers from the stones. The campfire flickered, casting brief flashes of orange light against the growing darkness. It wasn't like any fire he had ever seen before. It burned too hot, too fiercely. And in the brief fleeting moments when the firelight caught the stones, they seemed to gleam with a light of their own, a strange, almost unnatural glow. Simon? It was Isabel's voice, soft, hesitant. He turned toward her, startled, as if she'd pulled him out of some trance. Are you okay? She stood now, eyes full of concern, her posture a little stiff. Yeah, I'm fine, Simon said, rubbing his face. His skin felt clammy, his heart still pounding from the strange moment. I don't know. I thought I heard something. Isabel raised an eyebrow. Heard something? What do you mean? The wind? He looked over his shoulder at the trees, as though the forest itself might suddenly answer him. The wind had died down, and the air felt heavier than ever, like a weight pressing against his chest. But it wasn't just the wind. It was the stones. The damn stones. It's nothing, he finally said, his voice hollow. He wanted to say something more, to warn her, but what could he say? He couldn't explain it. How could he explain that the world itself felt different here? How could he explain that the trees were too close, that the sky was too dark, and that the stones were watching them, whispering, calling to them? Isabel seemed unconvinced, but said nothing further. Instead, she gave him a small nod and went back to the fire, settling next to Grace and Michael, who were now unpacking food and beer, as if nothing had changed, as if everything were still normal. But Simon couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that they were no longer alone. He stepped toward the stone circle, unsure of what was pulling him forward. The closer he got to the stones, the more the whispers grew, curling around him like the fog rolling in off the mountains. The air was so thick with it that it was almost suffocating. His breath became shallow, the world narrowing to the ancient stones that stood before him. Join us. The whisper was clear now, louder than before, though it still carried the same hollow, empty tone, as if it came from somewhere far away, somewhere beneath the earth. His legs trembled as he moved closer, despite every instinct screaming for him to turn back. "Please," Simon whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. "What do you want?" The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, a faint vibration moving through the earth, like something was stirring deep below. He froze, staring down at the ground as it rippled under him, the air around him shifting, warping, as though reality itself was bending. His skin crawled, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. But it wasn't the ground. It was the stones. Suddenly, he felt a sharp, overwhelming pressure in his chest, as though something was pushing against his ribs, trying to crush the breath from him. The stones seemed to pulse with energy, their cold surfaces vibrating beneath his touch. It was like standing at the edge of something vast, something terrible, like the very foundation of the world had been disturbed. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, his pulse racing. And then, just as suddenly, the pressure lifted. The feeling of being crushed receded, leaving him with nothing but a sick, cold sensation in his stomach, a creeping dread that crawled into his bones and made him feel hollow. "Simon?" It was Grace's voice, and he turned to see her standing at the edge of the camp, her brow furrowed in concern. "What the hell's going on with you?" Simon didn't know how to answer. He couldn't even find the words to explain what he was feeling. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but everything seemed jumbled, disjointed. He began, but his voice faltered, and he looked back toward the stone circle. It was silent now, still as though nothing had happened at all. But Simon knew better. The trees, which had seemed to press in closer, had now grown still, their branches hanging like heavy, lifeless arms. The sky, too, had darkened. It wasn't the deep, velvet black of night. It was a sickly gray, as if the sun was still trying to set, but was stuck, suspended in a never-ending twilight. Grace stepped forward, her hand on her hip. "Come on, let's get some food in you. You've got to be starving after the hike." Simon nodded absently, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. But he couldn't move. He couldn't bring himself to take another step away from the circle. Something was wrong. The world was wrong. He turned back toward the stones, his chest tightening, his head spinning. "Join us, or stay forever." The voice came again, louder this time, echoing inside his skull, vibrating through his bones. He staggered back, a rush of cold air sweeping over him, sharp and biting, as though it had come from deep beneath the ground. He couldn't breathe. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, his body trembling with a primal, bone-deep terror. The whisper didn't stop. It didn't give him time to think, to breathe. It just was, a presence in the air, all-encompassing and insistent. "Join us, or stay forever." "No," Simon whispered, his voice breaking. But it was too late. The earth beneath his feet shifted once more, the sound of something moving in the soil. He felt the pull again, that terrible, sickening weight. The trees around him seemed to lean in closer, their shadows stretching, forming something more than just dark shapes. The stones felt like they were breathing, exhaling a foul air that clung to him, suffocating him. "Simon?" It was Isabel's voice this time, sharp and desperate, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter because Simon was already stepping toward the stones. He didn't know why, but his feet moved as if of their own accord, drawn by the pull of the whispers, the pull of whatever ancient force had awakened beneath the stones. The trees leaned closer, and Simon felt his soul begin to unravel. The moment Simon stepped forward, it was as if the earth itself had opened up beneath him, its cold, unforgiving fingers reaching into the depths of his chest, pulling him closer to the circle. The whispers were no longer faint. They surrounded him, coiling around his mind, dragging him deeper into the heart of the stone circle. He could feel the air pressing in on him, thick and suffocating, like it had turned to something solid, something alive, something that didn't belong. His feet moved of their own accord, his body obeying a pull he couldn't resist, and in his chest, the tight grip of dread twisted, curling deeper with every step. Behind him, he heard the distant sound of footsteps, slow but determined, but it didn't matter. They couldn't stop him. Nothing could. "Simon, stop." The voice was sharp, filled with panic. It was Grace, her voice cutting through the rising tide of whispers, but he barely heard her. All he could hear now was the chanting that had grown louder, more insistent. The voices from the stones urging him forward. He reached the center of the circle. The air was colder here, biting and sharp, and the ground beneath his feet felt wrong. It was soft, like something was moving under the earth, shifting in rhythm with his heartbeat. The stone at the center was massive, larger than the others, and its surface seemed to shimmer with an eerie light, as if it were alive, breathing. Simon reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it against the stone. The surface was icy, colder than anything he had ever felt before, and the moment his skin made contact, a rush of images flashed in his mind. Flashes of people he didn't recognize, their faces distorted, twisted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. His heart hammered in his chest, a scream rising in his throat, but it was swallowed by the overwhelming pressure that descended upon him. The whispers in the air turned into guttural growls, filling his ears, pushing against his skull. "Join us, join us, join us." It was no longer a whisper. It was a demand. Behind him, the others were shouting his name, their voices desperate, pleading. But it felt so distant, like they were standing at the edge of a dream, their words muffled by the growing force that was suffocating Simon. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. He only felt the stone beneath his palm, the cold that seeped into his very bones, and the terrible weight of the presence that surrounded him. "Simon." No exclamation marked Grace's voice, louder now, breaking through the haze in his mind. "Come back. Get away from the stone." But Simon couldn't move. His hand was pressed against the stone, his body frozen in place. He could feel the earth shifting beneath him, a slow, creeping vibration that seemed to seep up from the ground, from the very heart of the stone circle. It felt like something was rising, awakening, something ancient, something hungry. The whispers grew louder still, merging with the vibrations, until they were one and the same. Simon felt his vision blur, his senses slipping away from him, as if the world was being torn apart and reassembled around him. In that moment, he was no longer standing in the forest, no longer surrounded by the others. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark, where the air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, a place where the sky had never seen the light of day, where the earth had never felt the warmth of the sun. Join us, or stay forever. The voices were not just in his head now. They were everywhere, inside him, around him, beneath him. They were coming from the stones. They were coming from the earth itself. And then, in a flash, Simon understood. This was no ordinary stone circle. It was a gateway, a door to something older, something darker than anything he had ever imagined. The stones were not just markers of a lost past. They were keepers of something, something that had been sealed away long ago, something that could never be allowed to return. But something had changed. The seal had cracked, and now it was waking up. A jagged pain shot through Simon's chest, and he gasped, stumbling back from the stone, his hand pulling away as though it had been burned. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his chest, the pain so intense that it felt like his heart was being torn from his body. "Simon!" It was Isabel's voice now, the panic evident in her tone. He could hear the shuffling of footsteps behind him, the others rushing toward him, but he couldn't move. The world around him spun, the earth beneath him shifting and trembling, as if the very ground were coming to life. "Simon, please," Isabel begged, kneeling beside him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Come back. Whatever's happening, it's not you. You have to fight it." But Simon couldn't. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't fight the pull of the stone, the grip of the ancient forces that were wrapping themselves around his mind, around his soul. He could feel them, feel their hunger, their need. The whispers were so loud now that they drowned out everything else, filling his thoughts, pulling him toward the stones, drawing him closer to the waiting darkness. He could hear Grace's frantic voice as she shouted for him, but it felt so far away, like she was speaking from another world. He couldn't understand her. He couldn't think. He could only feel the pull, feel the desire of whatever it was on the other side of the stones. And then, just as he thought he might lose himself completely, a loud crack echoed through the air, sharp and sudden. The ground shook, the stones trembled. Something alive was coming. Simon looked up, his vision blurry, his mind hazy, and saw it. A figure stepped out from behind the stone, tall and thin, draped in shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe like living things. It was more of a presence than a person, a shadow that bent the light around it, distorting the air. It was barely human, its form a twisted mockery of flesh and bone, its face hidden beneath a hood of dark tendrils, but its eyes, they were not eyes. They were voids, empty spaces that seemed to pull everything toward them. Everything. The figure raised its hand, pointing toward Simon, and the whispers grew louder, now an overwhelming roar, like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, urging him to move, to step closer, to surrender. And Simon could do nothing but obey. The figure moved closer, its long, thin limbs stretching unnaturally with each step, like some dark creature from the depths of an old nightmare. Simon's mind screamed in protest, but his body was no longer his own. He had no control over it. His feet shuffled toward the stone circle, toward the figure that was now standing just beyond the stone at the center. The figure's hollow eyes, no, not eyes at all, but empty voids, stared into him, and for the first time in his life, Simon knew what true terror felt like. It was a terror that crawled deep inside his soul, spreading like ink on paper, tainting everything it touched. "Simon, no, don't." Grace's voice, sharp and frantic, broke through the deafening roar of the whispers. It felt like she was miles away, a faint cry against the abyss. He turned his head, trying to focus on her, but his vision was clouded, like looking through a thick fog. The world around him seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, everything blurring and shifting. It was as if he were caught in a dream, except this dream didn't have an escape, didn't have a happy ending. The figure stepped forward, its movements smooth, too smooth, like it was gliding just above the ground. The dark tendrils that hung from its head writhed and twisted like serpents, and a chilling laugh, low and guttural, bubbled up from deep within its chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very air. It was laughing at him. Simon's heart pounded painfully in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. "What do you want?" he croaked, his voice barely audible above the shrill whispers. "What are you?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering him, before it raised one thin finger and pointed directly at Simon. A flash of cold shot through him, freezing him to the bone, and the laughter stopped. The whispers, which had been so deafening, became a distant hum, like the buzz of an insect caught in the walls of a house. The figure's lips, thin, almost non-existent, twitched into a smile, but it was a smile without warmth, a smile that spoke of death, of things that had been dead for far too long. "You've come," the figure rasped, its voice a harsh whisper, as if the air itself had difficulty carrying the words. "You've joined us." Simon shook his head, his pulse racing in his ears. He didn't understand. His legs trembled, his hands shaking violently as he tried to back away. But the figure's grip on him was unseen, like invisible fingers wrapped around his chest, squeezing tight. No, I haven't." His voice cracked, his breath turning to ice in his lungs. "I haven't joined you. I don't—" The figure took another step closer, its hollow eyes now locked onto his, boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. A whisper, no, a command, rose from its lips. "Stay." The word was an anchor, a weight pulling him deeper into the curse that had already begun to consume him. He felt it then, the pressure, the sinking feeling, as though he were being drawn into the earth itself. The ground beneath his feet was soft, like wet clay, and it shifted, not just in the way that earth shifts beneath a hiker's boots, but in the way that something ancient moves, something buried beneath layers of time and history, stretching toward him, reaching out with invisible fingers. Simon tried to scream, to force the words from his mouth, but no sound came. His lungs refused to work, his throat constricted, as though the very air had turned to stone. He wanted to run, wanted to fight, but his body was frozen, locked in place by some dark force that had taken hold of him. From the edge of the stone circle, he could hear the others shouting his name, but their voices were muffled, distant, like they were trapped in another world, one where he no longer belonged. The ground trembled again, a low, rumbling sound vibrating through the air, and Simon felt it, something else moving beneath him, rising from the earth, something ancient and vast, as if the stone circle had opened a door to a place where time and space didn't matter anymore. And then, there it was, a figure stepping out from the shadows. It was a man, but not a man, at least not in any way Simon would recognize. His clothes were tattered, ripped to shreds by time, his skin gray and mottled with decay. His eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at Simon with an unblinking intensity that made his stomach churn. But it was his smile that horrified Simon the most. It was wide, too wide, stretching across his face like a grotesque mask. His teeth were yellow and jagged, like old bones, and as he stepped closer, Simon could hear the slow rasp of his breath, labored and wet. "Join us," figure asked, his voice wet and throaty, like something trapped under the earth. "Join us, and never leave." It was then that Simon realized the man, the figure, the thing standing in front of him, wasn't a man at all. He was something that had been lost, something that had been trapped here, in this cursed place, waiting for someone foolish enough to step into its grasp, waiting for him. Simon's eyes darted to the others, to the people who had followed him into the forest, to the friends who had been too curious, too eager to explore. They were standing at the edge of the stone circle now, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Grace was holding her hands out to him, her lips trembling as she called his name again. "Simon, come back, please." But it was too late. It had always been too late. The moment they stepped into the circle, they had been marked. This was not a place of freedom. This was a place of restraint. The stones were not a pathway out. They were a trap, an ancient snare built to keep souls bound to this place forever. And now, Simon was one of them. The figure who had first appeared beside the stone raised its hands, a sound like the fluttering of wings filling the air. The other figures, those who had been hiding, waiting, began to emerge from the shadows, stepping out one by one. They were the same as the man who had come before, dressed in tatters, faces twisted and hollow, their eyes locked on Simon, the hunger in their gaze unmistakable. "Join us," they murmured in unison, their voices a soft chorus of death. Grace screamed his name again, and Michael and Isabel, too, tried to run toward him. But the ground was no longer solid beneath their feet. It was soft and wet, pulling at their boots, holding them in place. The stones were growing, stretching taller, their dark forms looming over the camp as if reaching toward the sky, toward the very stars themselves. And Simon could do nothing but watch. The whispering, the chanting, the low hum of a world that no longer cared for the living filled the air, drowning out everything else. He felt his feet begin to lift from the earth, as if something invisible was pulling him toward the center of the circle, toward the stone. His last thought, if it could even be called that, was of the world beyond the stone circle, the world of the living. And then, just as he was drawn into the void, his body collapsing into the dark embrace of the stones, Simon understood. The dead never left. They were always there, waiting for the next soul to wander too far. The world spun in a violent blur. Simon's body jerked as though it were being pulled apart, torn between the earth and something far worse than anything he could have imagined. His mind screamed in terror, but it was a hollow, distant sound, like something lost to time. The darkness wrapped around him, an oppressive, suffocating weight that seemed to crush the very air from his lungs. His eyes squeezed shut, his hands clenched into fists, but none of it mattered. There was no escape. The whispers rose again, louder this time, a chorus of voices from all around, pressing in on him from every direction. They weren't just in his head anymore. They were in his skin, under his nails, in the very marrow of his bones. And in those whispers, there was no mercy. There was no kindness. There was only a dark promise of forever. "Join us," they hissed, their words slithering over his skin like a cold wind. "Stay with us. Forever." Simon's heart thundered in his chest, but it wasn't his heartbeat anymore. It was the pulse of the stone circle, the ancient rhythm of a place that had never been meant to be disturbed. The ground beneath him shifted again, and this time It wasn't just the earth that moved. It was something deeper, something alive. He opened his eyes, but all he saw was the stone, the massive, ancient pillar at the center of the circle. It loomed over him like a monument to despair, its jagged surface etched with markings that twisted and writhed as though they were alive. The stone seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and Simon could feel it, pulsing in time with his own thoughts. He was part of it now. He could feel himself slipping away, as though his very soul was being pulled toward the stone, absorbed into it, lost forever. The figure that had first emerged, the one with the empty, hollow eyes, was now beside him. It stood so close that Simon could feel its cold breath on his skin, its presence pressing against him, suffocating him. He tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't obey. He could feel the stone's pull, a magnetic force, strong and insistent. It wanted him. It needed him. "You're one of us now," the figure rasped, its voice a low growl, the words vibrating through Simon's bones. It stepped forward, its hand reaching out, thin fingers brushing against Simon's cheek. The touch was like ice, sharp and unrelenting, and for a moment Simon felt his vision cloud. He was losing himself. The darkness was pulling him in, swallowing him whole. But then a sound, a faint sound, a whisper in the distance. "Simon." His heart skipped, and his eyes shot open. It was Grace, her voice, desperate, breaking through the fog that clouded his thoughts. It wasn't just a memory anymore. She was here. She was still out there. "Simon, you have to fight it. Fight it." He struggled, fought against the pull of the stone, but the force surrounding him was too strong. His body trembled, his limbs shaking with the effort, but his mind was slipping. It was a thin thread, unraveling faster than he could hold onto it. The stone was so close now, its jagged edges brushing against his chest, and he felt it, the coldness, the emptiness that lurked just beyond the stone. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss, knowing that once you fell, you would never climb out again. "You cannot leave," the figure hissed, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You are ours now. You belong to us, as we belong to the stone, as we belong to the forest." Another laugh, low and gravelly. Simon felt the laugh in his bones, felt it clawing its way into his soul. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body no longer felt like his own. It was as though the stone, the circle, everything around him was consuming him, piece by piece. And in the back of his mind, a horrible truth settled in. This wasn't just about him. This wasn't just about the curse of the stone circle. This was about all of them. You all belong. His legs gave way. He collapsed to the ground, the earth shaking beneath him as he fell to his knees. The stone was so close now, the whispers louder than ever, demanding, urging him to join them, to step into the darkness, to never leave. But then a surge of movement, a flash of light. It was Isabel, her face wild with fear and determination as she reached out, her hands gripping Simon's shoulders. "Simon, no!" Her voice broke through the fog in his mind, shattering the haze of terror that had surrounded him. He gasped for breath, his chest heaving as the cold, oppressive weight of the stone lifted, just slightly. For a moment, he could think again. He could feel. He could remember. "Simon, you have to come back. You have to fight." The figure hissed, and the shadows around them thickened, swirling like a storm about to break. But Isabel's grip was firm, and Simon felt a spark, just a spark, of his own strength returning. He pushed himself up, and Isabel's arms tightened around him, pulling him back. But the figure wasn't finished. It moved closer, its voice rising in a screech of fury, the air thick with its dark energy. No one leaves this place. The world shifted again, the ground beneath them trembling violently. The air thickened, the forest closing in, the trees shifting, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for Simon, for Isabel, for everyone who had stepped into this cursed place. You cannot escape. And then, in the distance, there was a crack, a single, sharp sound, like the breaking of something ancient, something important. Simon's heart raced. He could feel the stone circle's grip tightening, but there was something else now, something different, a shift. A tremor ran through the air, and the figure recoiled, its twisted form faltering as if something was beginning to push back, to push against the curse. It wasn't just the stone now. It was the forest. The whispers grew louder, no longer pleading, no longer calling. They were panicked, frantic. Something was wrong. Something had changed. And that's when Simon realized it. The stone circle was never meant to be opened, but it was breaking, slowly, painfully, and the forces it had kept locked away, those ancient, restless spirits, were fighting to stay bound. The curse wasn't just an ancient trap. It was a battle between the living and the dead, the past and the present. The forest wasn't just closing in on them. It was fighting back. "Run!" Isabel screamed, pulling Simon with her as they scrambled away from the stone, the ground beneath them shaking with the force of something awakening, something powerful. But as they ran, the trees continued to shift, their branches stretching and twisting toward them like dark skeletal hands reaching for their lives. And behind them, the whispers, the voices of the dead, grew silent. For now, the night the full moon rose, something shifted in the air, like the tightening of a wire just before it snapped. You could feel it if you were in the right place, standing on the cracked sidewalks of silver pines, or lingering near the old oak tree that had stood watch over the town for longer than anyone could remember. There was something off. It was as if the very earth was holding its breath, waiting, watching. The full moon had always been an event in Silver Pines, though no one spoke about it aloud. People simply knew to be wary, knew to lock their doors and windows, and to stay indoors until the moon's light had faded to nothing but a distant, unremarkable sliver. The town was small enough that rumors could grow wild, twisting around the minds of its inhabitants until they became something more than stories. There were whispers of creatures in the woods, voices that called from beyond the trees. But it was just folklore, they said, just superstition. At least, that's what some people believed. It was late in the evening when Henry Tatum noticed it. He was sitting in his living room, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease as he flipped through the channels on his ancient television set. He had lived in Silver Pines his entire life, and it had always been the same. Life was predictable, boring even, and the full moon only brought a fleeting sense of discomfort, nothing more. He had long since stopped paying attention to the old stories his grandmother used to tell him, the ones about shadows lurking in the corners of the town, or the strange happenings that seemed to occur on the night of the full moon. But tonight, something felt different. It wasn't just the moon, full and round in the sky outside his window. No, it was something else, something unseen, creeping through the cracks in the town's facade. As the clock struck midnight, Henry felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The silence outside was profound, unnerving. There was no sound of the usual late-night wildlife, no distant hum of traffic from the highway, just quiet, the kind of quiet that made his pulse quicken. Then there was a sound, a soft scraping, faint but distinct. It came from the window. He tried to brush it off as the wind, but deep down, he knew better. He got up and walked to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The moonlight bathed the streets in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts along the pavement. As he peered out into the darkness, he saw nothing, just the empty streets, the silhouette of a few houses, and the towering trees that lined the outskirts of town. But then a figure emerged from the woods, stumbling into the dim light of the street lamp. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a person, not entirely. The figure was hunched over, walking at a strange angle, dragging its limbs across the ground like it was struggling to move. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, and its face was twisted, elongated, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. It wasn't human, not anymore. Before he could react, the figure stopped and turned its head slowly, as though it knew it was being watched. Henry froze, his mind racing. He wanted to look away, to close the curtains, to pretend none of this was happening. But he couldn't. The thing's gaze felt like it was burning into him. And for a moment, he could have sworn it smiled. A cold, twisted grin, stretching across a face that didn't belong to anything human. Then, with a sudden jerk, the figure straightened up and ran off into the woods, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Henry stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind unable to process what he had just witnessed. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light? But no, there was no mistaking what he had seen. He'd lived in Silver Pines long enough to know that nothing was ever quite as it seemed, especially when the full moon was high in the sky. He felt a shiver run down his spine. The next morning, Henry walked into the local diner, trying to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The small, greasy spoon had been the town's gathering place for as long as anyone could remember. It was a place where the old-timers sat around the counter, gossiping about the weather, and the younger crowd lingered over coffee, swapping stories about their uneventful lives. But today, it felt different. People were talking, but it wasn't the usual idle chatter. There was a tension in the air, a quiet discomfort that lingered in the corners of the room. "Morning, Henry," said Ellie, the waitress, her voice tight. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him, but there was something strange in her eyes. She wasn't looking at him directly. Her gaze kept darting around the room, as though she were expecting something, or someone. "Morning, Ellie. Anything new around here?" Henry asked, trying to sound casual. Ellie hesitated before answering. "Have you heard about the Jenkins boy? You know, Tommy Jenkins. He's missing." Henry's stomach dropped. Tommy Jenkins was just a kid, barely in his teens. His family lived down the street from Henry's house, and he was always out playing with the other kids, running through the streets and getting into trouble. He couldn't have just disappeared. "What do you mean missing?" Henry asked, his voice low. "When did it happen?" "Last night," Ellie said. her eyes flicking toward the window. They found his bicycle, but no sign of him. It's like he just vanished. Some folks say they heard strange noises, voices, out by the woods. And then, nothing. Just gone. Henry's mind raced. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared in Silver Pines during the full moon, but it had been years since anything like this had happened. There had always been stories about things that roamed the woods when the moon was full. But this was different. This was real. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Ellie, do you think it's, related to the moon?" Ellie's eyes widened, and for a moment, Henry could see the fear in her. The same fear that had been gnawing at him since the night before. "I don't know, Henry, but I'm starting to think there's something to all those old stories. Something we don't understand." Henry nodded grimly. The air in Silver Pines had always felt heavy during the full moon, but he never imagined it was connected to anything like this. He had to find out more, had to know if there was something real behind the disappearances, the shadows, the creatures in the woods. He finished his coffee, the warmth of the liquid doing little to calm his nerves. Whatever was happening in this town, it was only just beginning, and it was only going to get worse. That evening, as the full moon climbed higher into the sky, Henry stood by his window again, watching the town. The wind had picked up, howling through the streets, rattling the trees and sending the shadows dancing in every direction. Something was out there, something waiting. He had no idea what he was about to uncover, but he knew one thing. Silver Pines would never be the same again, and neither would he. Henry lay awake that night, unable to sleep, the unsettling events of the evening replaying over and over in his mind. The whispers of Ellie, the disappearance of Tommy Jenkins, and that shadowy figure in the woods. They all swirled together, a tangled mess in his head. The full moon had reached its zenith now, its light pouring through the cracks of his curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across his room. He stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on him. Something was wrong with Silver Pines. He had lived here for most of his life, and he knew the town like the back of his hand. But tonight, everything felt different. He had never been one to believe in ghosts or legends, but there was something in the air tonight that made it hard to dismiss the stories. The ones his grandmother used to whisper to him when he was a child, about the cursed history of the town, the strange rituals performed by its founders, the way the land itself seemed to hold on to the dark past. It was just superstition, he had told himself all those years ago. But now, as the moon bathed everything in its cold light, it felt like the very fabric of the town was unraveling. The questions kept coming. What had happened to Tommy? What was that thing he had seen in the streets? And why, every time the moon reached its fullest, did everything in Silver Pines turn wrong? He tossed and turned, unable to find rest. Outside, the wind howled like some ancient creature lost in the woods, calling out for something or someone. At around 3 in the morning, the hairs on the back of Henry's neck prickled. There was a sound, barely perceptible at first, a scraping noise, faint and rhythmic, almost like the sound of claws against the pavement. Henry's heart thudded in his chest. It was coming from outside. He crept out of bed, pulling on his boots and a jacket. Yet with every step, he felt the pull of something dark, like gravity was shifting beneath him. Slowly, he crept toward the front door, his breath shallow and quick. His hand trembled as he gripped the doorknob. When he opened the door, the cold air hit him like a slap to the face. He stepped out onto the porch, the moonlight casting everything in an otherworldly glow. The sound was clearer now, unmistakable. Scraping, tapping, almost like a slow, deliberate march. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help it. His gaze drifted toward the street, and there, just beyond the edge of the yard, was a figure. The same figure he had seen earlier, hunched, dragging itself through the darkness. The pale skin, the strange, jerking movements. It wasn't a person anymore, not in the traditional sense. For a moment, they simply stood there, the figure and Henry, locked in some kind of unspoken standoff. The air was thick with something that felt ancient, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl. Then, the figure slowly raised its head, its dark eyes locking onto Henry's. The cold, predatory smile stretched across its face once again. Henry froze. A wave of dread washed over him, suffocating and oppressive. His legs felt like lead, his breath stuck in his chest. He couldn't move. The figure took a slow step forward, and then another. The scraping sound grew louder, more urgent. Henry's heart hammered against his ribcage. The figure was coming toward him. A flicker of panic shot through him. Get inside, get inside, get inside, he thought, his mind racing for any escape. But he couldn't. His body refused to cooperate. It was as if the moonlight itself had cast a spell over him, freezing him in place. Just when he thought he might be swallowed whole by the thing, there was a sudden crash. A shadow blurred across the street. A flash of movement, so quick, so fleeting, that Henry thought for a moment his eyes had betrayed him. The figure in front of him hesitated, its head snapping toward the movement. It paused, then disappeared into the woods, just like before. Henry stood there, heart racing, chest heaving with breath. The moment he could finally move, he darted inside, slamming the door behind him. He locked it with shaking hands and sank to the floor, his head spinning. What was that thing? What had it wanted? And what had just scared it off? He stayed on the floor for what felt like hours, replaying the scene over and over in his head. Had it really gone? Was it truly gone? Finally, exhaustion crept in. His body demanded rest, despite the swirling storm in his mind. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the figure's face, its hollow eyes staring at him from the darkness. The next morning, Henry woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. The sun was up, but the town of Silver Pines seemed quieter than usual. There were no sounds of birds or the usual hustle and bustle that accompanied the morning routine. It felt wrong. The shadows were deeper, darker, despite the fact that the sun was shining. He quickly dressed and made his way out into the streets, his eyes scanning the town as he walked. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The town was eerily empty. No cars, no people, just the occasional flicker of movement in the distance. As he passed by the town's church, he saw a group of people gathered near the steps, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. The older folks, the ones who had lived here long enough to know all the town's secrets, were speaking in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Henry approached one of the men, an older fellow named Ray, who had lived in Silver Pines for as long as Henry could remember. "Ray," Henry said, his voice shaky. "What's going on?" Ray didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Henry, as if weighing something, Before he finally spoke, "We've been waiting for you to ask, Henry," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "It's happening again. The full moon's curse. It started. And this time, I think it's different." Henry's stomach sank. The curse? He had heard the stories as a child, but they had always been nothing more than whispers, ghost stories to scare the kids. But this was real. Something had changed in Silver Pines, something older than anything he could understand. "We need to talk," Ray continued, his eyes darting toward the woods, toward the shadows where the creatures had disappeared. "And we need to talk fast." Henry followed Ray in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on him. They walked in the direction of the old town hall, a crumbling building at the edge of the square. It hadn't been used for decades, the windows boarded up, the bricks worn and chipped. It was a place few people bothered to visit anymore. Ray had always been a man of few words, but today his silence was filled with an urgency that sent a chill through Henry. The town hall loomed ahead, its outline barely visible in the shadow of the trees. The smell of damp earth and decaying wood was thick in the air, a scent that Henry had come to associate with the darker parts of Silver Pines. They passed through a gate that creaked on its hinges, the rusted bars protesting their intrusion. As they reached the entrance, Ray stopped, turning to Henry with a strange look in his eyes, something between pity and fear. "You're going to want to hear this, son," Ray muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "But you're not going to like it." Henry's stomach tightened. He had no idea what Ray meant by that, but he had already seen too much, and there was no going back now. Ray opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning like an old man awakening from a long sleep. The air inside was thick with the musty scent of old paper, stale wood, and dust that hadn't been disturbed for years. As they stepped inside, the dim light from outside barely pierced the gloom. It felt as though the very walls were absorbing the light, sucking it in and leaving behind nothing but shadows. They walked down a narrow hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. At the end of the hall was a large room, the walls lined with shelves, all filled with old books and ledgers. But it wasn't the books that caught Henry's attention. It was the table at the center of the room. The table was old, made of heavy oak, and covered in symbols that Henry didn't recognize. Strange carvings, jagged lines and spirals, etched deep into the wood. As Ray moved closer, Henry saw that the symbols weren't just random markings. They were arranged in a pattern, like a map or a ritualistic design. "Sit," Ray said, motioning to a chair next to the table. "I've got to show you something." Henry hesitated for a moment, then sat, the chair creaking under his weight. Ray moved to a nearby shelf and pulled down a thick, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, as if it had been passed down through generations. Ray opened it carefully, flipping through the pages with a reverence that felt unnatural, as if he was afraid to disturb the fragile words contained within. He stopped on a page near the back and turned it toward Henry. The page was covered in more symbols, more intricate and twisted than those on the table. The writing was in a language Henry didn't understand, but the symbols, they were unmistakable. They were the same as those carved into the oak. "What is this?" Henry asked, his voice trembling. Ray's hand hovered over the page. "This," he said quietly, "is the history of Silver Pines. The real history, the one they don't teach in schools. It's all tied to the moon and to what happened here long before any of us were born." Henry frowned. The moon? What do you mean? Ray sighed and took a seat across from Henry, his face drawn tight with worry. The founders of this town, well, they weren't just settlers, you see. They were something else. They came here with a purpose. They knew this land was special. It was cursed, yes, but it was also powerful. There's something in the ground here, something old. They built the town on it, and they used the full moon as a way to tap into that power. Henry's mind raced. He had always thought the town had a strange energy, something that made it feel off, but he had never considered it might be more than just local folklore. Every month, Ray continued, on the night of the full moon, the founders would perform rituals to commune with whatever power lay beneath the earth. They believed it was a way to harness its strength, to make the town thrive. But it came with a price. People started disappearing, objects started moving on their own, and the full moon began to affect the town in ways no one could explain. Henry felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had heard of the disappearances, of course. Everyone in town had. But he had never connected them to anything like this. The shadows in the streets, the strange figures that appeared and vanished, the whispers in the dark. Was it all tied to these rituals, to whatever was lurking in the soil beneath the town? So what happened to them? Henry asked, his voice low. The founders, I mean. What did they do when the moon's influence started to take hold? Ray's face darkened. They didn't stop. They couldn't. They kept going, each month, drawing more power from the earth, more than they should have, and eventually, it consumed them. The town turned on itself. The people started seeing things, hearing things. The full moon didn't just bring power anymore. It brought madness, death. The spirits of the founders, they never left. They're still here, in the earth, in the air. And when the moon is full, they wake up. Henry's mind was spinning. It sounded like a nightmare, a story conjured up in some dark corner of the town's past. But the evidence was clear. The strange happenings, the disappearances. It wasn't just coincidence. Ray stood up suddenly, his face a mask of grim resolve. You need to get out of here, Henry. The moon's almost full, and things are already starting to happen. People are already gone, just like before. There's no stopping it now. The full moon is drawing them out, and the spirits, they're calling for more. Henry felt a cold chill settle in his chest. What do you mean, calling for more? Who are they calling for? Ray met his gaze, his eyes filled with a sorrow Henry couldn't quite place. They're calling for you, Henry, and for everyone else in this town. The curse, it doesn't stop with just the founders. It spreads, and if you don't find a way to stop it, you'll be just another victim of the full moon, just like all the others. Henry stared at Ray, the words sinking in like stone into water, spreading outward, touching everything. The room felt colder now, the light outside diminishing as the day wound its way to the darkening edges of twilight. He could feel something stirring in the air, a shift, like the town was holding its breath. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as if he could hold on to reality itself by sheer force. The last remnants of sunlight glinted off the edges of Ray's weathered face, casting long shadows across the old room. Ray didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, looking down at Henry with a mixture of concern and something else, a kind of resigned sorrow that Henry couldn't shake. You think I'm lying? Ray finally asked, his voice thick with a quiet intensity. "You think I'm just some crazy old man, talking about things that don't make sense." Henry opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He'd seen too much, felt too much in the last few days, to dismiss it all as madness. The whispers in the streets, the strange occurrences, the growing unease. It was all connected. He could feel it, like the weight of an old truth pressing down on him, smothering him under its inevitability. "No," Henry said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think you're lying. I think something's happening here, something I don't understand, and I don't know how to stop it." Ray's eyes softened just for a moment as he sat down across from Henry again. He didn't speak right away, but Henry could see the heaviness in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged. It was as if the weight of the town's curse had become too much for even him to bear. "You're not the first one to think that," Ray said, his voice low. "There's been others, people who tried to stop it before. They all disappeared. They couldn't fight it, not without understanding what they were up against." Henry's chest tightened at the thought. The full moon, the spirits, the curse. It had all been growing, swirling like a storm over the town, and it was only getting worse. He felt something inside him, a deep urge to stop it, to end the cycle before it consumed more lives, but he didn't know how. Ray was the only one who seemed to know, and even he didn't have the answers. Ray leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. "The Founders," he began, then paused as if gathering his thoughts. "They made a pact, you see. They thought they could control the power of the moon, use it to make the town prosper. They didn't realize that it wasn't just a source of power. It was a force, something much older, much darker than anything they could comprehend." Henry's mind raced, but they had to have known, right? They had to know it would cost something. Ray shook his head, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "They thought they could control it, but they couldn't. No one can. The full moon isn't just a phase, it's a gateway. It's when the veil between the living and the dead thins. And every time it happens, the town, well, it's like it gets caught in the middle of two worlds. The Founders thought they could manipulate it, harness it, but it's been using them ever since." Henry swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, as if the very air in the room had turned to dust. It was all beginning to make sense in a way that terrified him. The town had been caught in this cycle for generations, and now it was his turn to pay the price. "What happened to the Founders?" Henry asked, dreading the answer. Ray's eyes darkened. "They didn't survive it. They were consumed, like everything else. The moon's power isn't something that can be controlled or harnessed. It devours everything in its path, and when it's full, the spirits of the dead rise, restless and hungry. They're not just spirits, they're something else, something more." Henry's mind spun, but one thing stood clear. The full moon wasn't just a celestial event. It was a curse, an ancient force that had been unleashed long ago, and the town of Silver Pines was its prison. The town had been built on a lie, and now, as the moon approached its fullest, the lie was threatening to break free. "So what do we do?" Henry asked, leaning forward, his voice tight. "How do we stop it?" Ray didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, his body stiff with age, and walked over to the far side of the room. There, tucked away behind a faded tapestry, was a small wooden chest. Ray moved slowly, his hand shaking as he unlocked it, revealing a collection of old papers, tattered and yellowed with age. He sifted through them for a moment, pulling out one particular sheet. He placed it in front of Henry with trembling hands. On it was a diagram, a map of sorts, showing the town and the surrounding woods. But it wasn't just a map. It was a ritual. Symbols were scattered across it, ones Henry had seen before, carved into the town hall's table, etched into the earth. And at the center of it all was the symbol of the full moon, a circle surrounded by strange markings, each one seeming to pulse with a hidden energy. Ray pointed to a spot near the edge of the map, where the symbol of the full moon was drawn in a darker ink than the rest. "There," he said. "That's where the ritual has to take place. It's the only way to sever the connection, to close the gateway once and for all. But it's not easy. It requires a sacrifice." Henry stared at the map, his heart pounding in his chest. "A sacrifice?" Ray nodded, his face grim. "A life, the power that's been drawn from the earth, from the spirits of the dead, has to be repaid. You can't just take it and not give something back. It's the only way to stop the moon from claiming anyone else." Henry's blood ran cold. And who's supposed to make the sacrifice? Ray met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's the thing, son. The full moon chooses. It always does." A long silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Henry's mind was reeling, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds of stone. A sacrifice, and the moon chose. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the town itself breathing down his neck, its past and its curse holding him in place. As he looked at Ray, the older man's words echoed in his mind. "You're going to be the one to stop it, Henry. The moon's coming for you." Henry's chest tightened as Ray's words settled into the air around him like a thick fog. The full moon was closing in, a shadow looming over everything. It was inevitable. The moon chose. And now it seemed to be waiting for Henry to play his part. He swallowed, his throat dry. Ray's eyes remained locked on him, full of some ancient sorrow that Henry couldn't begin to understand. The town's curse, its suffocating grip, was tied to the moon, and somehow it had all led him to this moment. The ritual, the sacrifice, the unknown. It was all too much, too overwhelming. But as the weight of it pressed down on him, something inside him snapped. He couldn't let this continue. He wouldn't let it continue. Not on his watch. Not on his life. But what choice did he have? He couldn't break the cycle. He wasn't strong enough to fight against a force this old, this powerful. "You don't have to do this," Ray said quietly, his voice filled with the wisdom of someone who had long given up fighting fate. "You could leave. You could run, but it would follow you. It always follows. The moon. It has a way of pulling people back. It wants you. It's already chosen." Henry's gaze shifted toward the window. The sky was dimming, the sun sinking lower behind the horizon. The full moon was just hours away. He could feel it, tugging at the edges of his consciousness, pulling him closer, like a magnet drawing him in. He had come this far, but now, standing at the precipice, he wasn't sure how to move forward. But Ray was right. Running wouldn't work. The town wasn't the only thing connected to the moon. It was in the very blood of its people. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. "What happens if I don't make the sacrifice?" Henry asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. Ray didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, walking over to the window. He stared out into the growing darkness, his eyes narrowing as if he could see something far beyond the trees, beyond the town itself. Henry could almost feel the weight of Ray's silence, the heaviness of decades of living with the knowledge of this curse. "They'll take someone else," Ray said, finally turning to face him. "The full moon's hunger can't be denied. It needs to be fed. If you don't make the sacrifice, it will choose another, someone from the town, someone innocent. And when it does, it won't be like anything you've seen before. The moon doesn't just take lives, Henry. It changes them. Those who are chosen are never the same. They become part of something else, something far darker. And that's the part of the curse that no one ever talks about. Once it has you, it doesn't let you go." Henry felt the air in the room grow thick, the darkness outside pressing closer, squeezing in from all sides. He could almost hear the whispers, those soft, insidious voices that always seemed to accompany the full moon. They were calling again, not for Ray, not for the town, but for him. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Henry asked, his voice breaking. "What if the moon has already decided? What if I'm already too late?" Ray's eyes softened, and he sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping, as if he had already given up on the fight. "You're not too late, but you don't have much time. You need to perform the ritual before the moon rises, before it's full. The moment it peaks, when it's at its highest in the sky, that's when the gateway opens. And if you don't stop it, everything changes. The spirits, the shadows, they'll all come for you, for everyone. And once they're free, they'll never leave." Henry shook his head. The fear was so thick, it threatened to choke him. But he couldn't turn back now. Not after everything he'd learned. Not after everything he'd seen. He thought of the town, its crumbling buildings, its strange, nervous people, of Ray and the others who had tried to warn him, and of the faces he'd seen at the town square the night before. Those faces, those hollow, vacant eyes. His fingers gripped the edge of the table as he stood, his legs shaking beneath him. "I'll do it," he said, his voice a thin, hoarse whisper. "I'll stop it." Ray nodded gravely, as if he had expected this answer all along. "Then we need to go. Now it's the only way to break the cycle." Henry nodded, though his heart pounded with 1,000 questions. Ray had given him the map, the diagram of the ritual, the place where it all had to happen. But standing here, knowing that the moon was rising, that the spirits would soon be free, Henry felt a deep, primal fear rising in his chest. He wanted to run, to scream, but that wouldn't stop the moon. It wouldn't stop the curse. He was all that stood between his town and the nightmare that waited for them in the shadows. As Ray reached for the door, Henry followed, his heart pounding like a drum. He didn't know how this would end. He didn't know if he was strong enough to do what needed to be done. But as he stepped into the night, the wind rushing past him, he could feel the weight of the moon bearing down on them both. It was already here, and it was waiting. The sea had never looked so indifferent. Martin stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the gray expanse of water below. It stretched out like a cold, empty canvas, a place where no one would hear you scream or care. The wind howled in his ears, whipping his coat around his legs as he gazed at the lighthouse perched on the farthest point of the rocky shore. The old building had stood there for as long as anyone could remember. Some said it had been there long before the first settlers arrived. A relic, a warning. Most of the townspeople in Old Willow Hollow called it the Lost Light. They told stories, warnings, really, of what had happened there so many years ago. Of the keeper, a man named Roderick Graves, who had disappeared without a trace. Or at least, that's what the papers said. The townsfolk spoke of him as if he had been swallowed by the very sea he was meant to guide ships through. Others whispered that he hadn't disappeared at all, that the light he kept was no ordinary lighthouse, and the ghost of Roderick Graves still haunted the windswept shores. There had been talk about the lighthouse ever since Martin was a boy. Rumors, stories too strange and unsettling to ignore. When he'd first heard about it from his father, he'd laughed, but as he grew older, those stories began to sink into him, like the tide creeping in on the sand. It wasn't the ghost of the keeper that fascinated him so much. It was what lay beneath, the darkness of the ocean, the sea's endless hunger. The old man at the inn had told him everything he needed to know, or everything he thought he needed to know. Martin could still hear his voice, grating and rough, like it had been dragged through the very earth. Don't go there, lad. It's cursed, and the sea takes more than you're willing to give. People have gone out there and never come back. And I'm not talking about the light either. You've been warned. But Martin wasn't a superstitious man. He wasn't the kind of person to run from what others feared. When he'd first arrived in Old Willow Hollow, the salty air and the low hum of the ocean had felt strangely comforting. He hadn't come here to turn back. Not now. His curiosity had driven him forward, and once something had a hold on him, it was hard to let go. The boat rocked slightly beneath him as he made his way toward the pier. The salty smell of the sea filled his nostrils, mixing with the damp wood and rustic metal of the dock. He had rented the boat for the day. It was old, weathered, and small, nothing like the sturdy ships he used to sail when he was younger. It creaked like it had secrets, and Martin found that oddly fitting. The old man had been right about one thing. The sea was a cruel mistress. The weather had started turning when he had arrived, but that hadn't stopped him. If anything, it had made the entire place feel even more ominous, as if the fog and the waves were conspiring against him. The air had thickened, the clouds hung low, and the wind had grown colder. But still, he pressed on. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was pulling him out to that lighthouse. Something he couldn't see, but something that was calling him all the same. Martin cast off, gripping the weathered oar with cold, calloused hands. The boat rocked violently as the sea rumbled below, each wave slamming into the hull with a force that felt more like an invitation than a warning. He glanced back at the distant town, shrouded in mist, and then at the lighthouse, growing larger with each stroke. The light at the top of the tower wasn't lit. It hadn't been for years, according to the locals. But Martin didn't mind. He was there for something more than the light. The stories had become a part of him, each telling more vivid and more disturbing than the last. They told of flickering lights in the tower on the darkest nights, of whispers carried on the wind. They spoke of the keeper who had vanished, and yet they spoke more of those who had gone after him, people who ventured into the lighthouse and never returned. What troubled Martin more than the stories, though, was the silence. The sea was never quiet. Even when the wind didn't blow, it would churn, it would hum, it would make noises that never fully explained themselves. It had always been that way. But there, at the foot of the lighthouse, there was nothing. No sound of the waves, no wind, no birds. Only the steady thrum of his own heart in his chest. He reached the small landing, the boat scraping against the rock as he hauled it up to shore. The lighthouse stood just a few yards ahead of him, its towering form dark against the gray sky. Its windows were shattered, and its door hung ajar, creaking in the wind. And still, the silence. Martin stepped onto the uneven ground, the rocky shore crunching beneath his boots. His heart rate quickened. He didn't know why he felt so uneasy. It was just a lighthouse, after all. Just an old, abandoned place with a haunted past. Yet there was something about it that made his skin crawl. Something about the way the structure leaned slightly to one side, as if it had been weathered not just by time, but by something far more sinister. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and began the short walk to the base of the tower. The air grew colder with every step he took, as if the building itself was pulling the warmth from his body. The door, hanging on rusty hinges, creaked again, louder this time. Martin pushed it open. It moved with surprising ease, revealing the dim interior of the lighthouse. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The smell of decay and salt lingered in the air, and the floors creaked under his feet. His eyes adjusted to the gloom as he stepped further inside. The walls were covered in mildew, and the remnants of what had once been furniture lay scattered around. Everything was in ruins. But the strangest thing of all was the stillness. There was no sound, no hum of the ocean, no breeze rustling through the broken windows, just the oppressive silence. And then, there was something else, a sound faint at first, like a whisper. Martin froze. He listened, trying to decipher the noise. It was coming from above, from the spiral staircase that led up to the tower. At first he thought it might have been the wind, or the creaking of the building settling. But no, there was something deliberate about the sound. A voice, soft and indistinct. He took a hesitant step forward, his footfall barely audible on the wooden floor. His hand gripped the rusted railing as he started climbing the narrow staircase. His heart was thudding in his chest now, each beat louder than the last. The whispering grew clearer with each step, and though he couldn't make out the words, the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice, a human voice, calling to him. He didn't stop climbing. The staircase creaked with every step Martin took, each groan of the wood seeming to pull him deeper into the silence. His breath was shallow now, his hand tight around the cold, rusted railing as he ascended. The whispering had grown more distinct, like a voice calling out from a great distance, but still, he couldn't understand the words. They seemed to slither around the edges of his mind, too soft to fully comprehend, but not soft enough to ignore. He paused halfway up the staircase, straining his ears. The voice was almost familiar. It had a quality to it, a sharpness in the way it cut through the air. He shivered, feeling the chill seep into his bones. He could almost imagine someone up there, waiting for him, watching him. But when he peered upward, he saw nothing, just a dark, winding path that led to the top of the tower. It's just the wind, he told himself, though even in the back of his mind, he knew he wasn't entirely convinced. The lighthouse was old, older than anything Martin had ever come across. The air was thick, heavier somehow, as if the place had swallowed up the very breath of the world. And yet, the more he climbed, the more real the whispers became. He wasn't alone. With a shaking breath, he pushed forward, each step bringing him closer to the unknown. The sound grew louder, pressing in on him from all directions. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, murmuring words he couldn't quite make out, but words that seemed intentional, as if they were meant to get his attention. When he reached the top, he hesitated for a moment, his foot hovering over the last step. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they had started, and in the heavy silence that followed, the only sound was the pounding of his own heart. His chest felt tight, like something was choking him from the inside. Martin stepped into the small, circular room at the top of the tower, his eyes immediately drawn to the large, cracked windows. The sea stretched out endlessly beyond them, dark and restless, as if it was alive and waiting. The room was in disarray. Broken furniture, shards of glass from the windows, and rotting timbers lay scattered across the floor. But it wasn't the physical damage that unnerved Martin the most. It was the feeling of something that wasn't quite right. He looked around, his eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of the place, and then he saw it. A small desk, pushed against the wall in the far corner. On it sat a single, weathered piece of paper, yellowed with age. A candle, long since burned out, lay beside it. The wax congealed in strange, twisted shapes. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, leaving only the remnants of a life once lived. Without thinking, Martin walked over and picked up the paper. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. There was writing on it, scrawled in uneven, hurried strokes. The ink was smudged in places, as if the writer had been shaking when they had written it. The light must never go out. If it does, the sea will come for us all. Martin's stomach churned as he read the words. The handwriting was unmistakable, messy, frantic, a warning, or perhaps a plea. But why had the keeper written this? And why leave it here, in the lighthouse, where no one would find it? His thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was so deep, so primal, that for a moment Martin didn't know if it was real or just his imagination playing tricks on him. Then he heard it again, louder this time. The growl turned into a hiss, like something old and malevolent was stirring in the dark. He spun around, his pulse quickening. The room was still empty, but the air had thickened, pressing against his skin like a heavy weight. His breathing was ragged now, as if the very air around him was suffocating him. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadow, a dark figure standing at the far edge of the room, barely visible in the gloom. Martin's heart stopped. It wasn't just the shadow that terrified him. It was the way it moved, or rather, the way it didn't. It didn't shift in the way a normal shadow would. It watched. It waited. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the shadow seemed to loom larger. His hand dropped to the hilt of his knife, instinct kicking in, but he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't do any good. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything a blade could protect him from. The whispering came again, but this time it was louder, clearer. A voice, deep and familiar, calling his name. But not his name. It was his father's voice. "Don't go near it, Martin," the voice said, hoarse, desperate, as if trying to warn him from some distant place. "It's too late for me, but you—" The rest of the sentence was lost in a cacophony of screams. The room seemed to shake as the shadows began to swirl around the walls, flickering like candle flames in the wind. Martin stumbled back, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest as the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that overlapped and twisted together, each one speaking a different language, a different threat. Suddenly, the shadow in the corner moved, faster than a man should move. It slid across the room, faster than the eye could follow, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it was standing right in front of him. It was a figure, a man, or what used to be a man. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. The skin of his face was stretched tight, almost too tight, as though it didn't belong there. His mouth was a thin, gaping line, twisted in an eternal grimace. The figure stared at Martin, its hollow eyes burning with a cold, infinite rage, the ghost of Roderick Graves. But Martin knew this wasn't just a ghost. Before he could react, before he could even scream, the figure lunged at him, its skeletal hands reaching out. He tried to move, to defend himself, but the cold grasp of the ghostly hands wrapped around his throat with inhuman strength. He couldn't breathe. The room was spinning, the air turning to ice in his lungs. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices shouting at him from every direction. He clawed at the hands around his neck, but it was no use. The cold was seeping into him, filling his veins with ice. And just as his vision began to fade, Martin realized the truth. The lighthouse had never been haunted by a ghost. It was a prison, and now he was its prisoner. Martin's world had gone black, the chill of the ghost's grip tightening around his neck until it consumed him whole. He felt his pulse hammering in his temples, the pressure in his skull growing, pushing, twisting. His body was a vessel of nothing but cold, and his lungs burned as he fought for air, each breath more ragged than the last. The world around him felt distant, unreal. The sound of his own heartbeat reverberated in his ears, each beat a slow drum that kept him tethered to whatever this nightmare was. His vision blurred, and he thought for a fleeting moment that he might die here, that the curse of the lighthouse would claim him, as it had claimed others before him. But then, in the depths of that suffocating darkness, something broke through. A voice. It was a whisper at first, indistinct, like a far-off murmur beneath the roar of the ocean. But then it sharpened, becoming clearer, stronger, until it cut through the air with jagged clarity. The voice, deep, guttural, yet laced with desperation, spoke to him. "You must wake up. You must not die here." Martin's heart stopped, as if the words had somehow forced time to hold still. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, but his mind screamed for him to listen. The voice wasn't that of Roderick Graves. No, this voice was older, rougher, yet unmistakably human. And it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a shout, booming in his mind, shaking the foundations of his very existence. "Wake up! Wake up!" His eyes snapped open, and for a moment he thought he had simply been lost in the abyss. The ghost's hands were still around his throat, but they didn't feel as solid now. The grip loosened, and Martin took a sharp, desperate breath, filling his lungs with air as though he had been drowning for an eternity. His vision cleared slowly, his mind reassembling itself, piece by piece. He was still in the lighthouse. The dark figure loomed before him, its skeletal hands hovering inches from his neck. But it wasn't just a ghost anymore. Martin could see it more clearly now. The malice in its empty eyes, the hunger in its expression, as if it were a thing that had never known rest. a thing that existed only to feed. But there was something else, something different. A voice was still echoing in the back of his mind, not from the ghost, but from somewhere deeper and darker, somewhere inside the lighthouse itself. Don't let it drag you in. Don't let it take you. The words clawed at Martin's thoughts, each syllable like nails scraping against glass, driving him into a corner of his own mind. The air in the tower was thick with dread now. The oppressive silence that had once filled the room, now gone, replaced by a low hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very walls. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing, and somehow waiting. Martin reached up, his hands shaking, and grasped the spectral arms around his neck, trying to pull them away. But the ghost's grip didn't waver. It didn't move. It simply stared down at him, those hollow eyes burning into him, seeping into his soul. You shouldn't have come, the voice inside him whispered again. The keeper is not the only thing that haunts this place. You've entered a prison, a prison. The word reverberated in his chest, a final truth that shook him to his very core. Suddenly, he understood. The ghost of Roderick Graves was not the only terror this place held. The lighthouse itself was cursed, a twisted beacon that drew in souls, trapped them in its ancient stone walls. It had become something more than a monument to the sea. It had become a vessel, a prison that housed whatever darkness had once plagued its keeper. But there was something else, a movement at the edge of the room, a flicker of motion. Something was behind him. He turned sharply, the ghost still clutching him, but the shadow in the corner had taken form. A figure, crouched low against the wall, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It wasn't human. It was something else entirely, something born from the dark corners of the lighthouse, something ancient. Its limbs were elongated, its body twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its skin, a sickly shade of gray, stretched too thin over its bones, the flesh gaunt and decayed. It was a creature of pure hunger, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth, sharp as blades. The creature lurched forward with terrifying speed, moving faster than Martin could react. Its skeletal hands shot out, its long claws scraping against the stone floor as it reached for him. The air seemed to freeze as the thing moved, its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him with its unnatural force. Martin gasped for breath, his thoughts scrambling as the creature's claws closed around his arm. It was cold, so cold, colder than the ghost's touch. The darkness around them seemed to bend, folding in on itself, as if the walls of the lighthouse had become something else entirely, something alive. You have to survive, the voice inside him urged, panic rising. It was louder now, like a cry for help. But it wasn't just the voice of the lighthouse. It was the voice of someone who had been here before. Someone who had been trapped in the same nightmare. The creature's claws dug deeper into his flesh, its grip unrelenting. Pain shot through him like fire. Martin cried out, but the sound was swallowed by the walls, lost in the ever-present hum that filled the air. His vision blurred again, the room spinning, and for a moment he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. But then, in the fog of his thoughts, one truth remained clear. The creature wanted him. It wanted him as much as the lighthouse did. And the worst part was, it always had. The realization hit him like a hammer. The lighthouse wasn't a prison just for the souls of the dead. It was a prison that fed on them, on everyone who came too close. The light in the tower was nothing more than an illusion, a lure for those who sought answers in the dark, only to be consumed by the same abyss that had claimed Roderick Graves. And now Martin was no different from the others, trapped, a prisoner of the sea and its hunger. The creature's face twisted closer, its mouth stretching wide, and just as it was about to sink its teeth into his flesh, a sound rang out. A crack. The figure faltered, its claws sliding from Martin's skin, and the creature recoiled with a screech. The shadow it cast across the floor seemed to writhe, and for a fleeting moment, Martin felt the grip on his throat weaken. He had no idea what had just happened, only that, for the briefest of seconds, he was free, and he wasn't sure how much longer that would last. The air inside the lighthouse had become a choking fog, thick with dread. Martin stood frozen for a moment, his pulse racing in his ears, as the creature recoiled from him, its shrill screech still echoing in the dark corners of the tower. The shadow that had gripped him was now pulling back, its form writhing like a living thing caught in a frenzy. It was as though it was retreating, unsure of what had just occurred. A crack had sounded just before the creature had faltered. Martin's mind grasped at the fleeting moment like a drowning man reaching for a rope. He had no idea what had caused the disruption, whether it was a supernatural force or some unseen presence. But whatever it was, it had given him a moment of fragile hope. But he knew that hope wouldn't last long. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to press in tighter around him, the low hum that had filled the air now vibrating more violently. The shadows in the room appeared to deepen, stretching toward him with malevolent intent. The creature, still hunched low, its eyes burning with hunger, moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were savoring its next strike. It was circling him, stalking him like a predator, its pale, sharp teeth glinting in the dim light of the broken windows. Martin felt his breath catch in his throat. His heart pounded like a drum, the noise deafening in his ears, drowning out everything else. He had no weapon, no way of fighting this thing. The only thing that kept him grounded was the strange, throbbing rhythm of the lighthouse itself, as if the building were alive, pulsating with an energy that threatened to consume him. The hum grew louder. "It's the light," the voice inside his head whispered again, clearer now. A woman's voice, soft yet panicked. "The light is the key." Martin's mind raced. The light, the beacon that stood above them, casting its eerie glow across the sea. It had been dim when he first arrived, a pale flicker in the distance like a dying star. But now it felt different, almost alive, as though it were calling to him. The lighthouse had always been a symbol of guidance, a guide for ships lost in the storm. But now it seemed to him more like a beacon to trap lost souls, a siren's call that drew in the weak, the lost, the ones who dared to seek answers. He knew that the only way out of this hellhole was to find a way to stop whatever power the light held. But how? How could he escape this cursed place if the very heart of it, the light, was what kept him trapped? He glanced around, trying to make sense of the room, his gaze landing on the shattered desk in the corner. His fingers still tingled from the strange sensation that had coursed through him when he had read the warning on the old paper. The light must never go out. That's what the keeper had written, wasn't it? Those words still lingered in his mind, an echo that reverberated deep in his gut. The ghost Roderick Graves had known. The keeper had been more than just a man with a duty. He had been a prisoner of this place. But had he ever truly been alive? Or had he, too, been claimed by the darkness? The creature's growl brought him back to the present. It had closed the distance between them, its breath foul and heavy, filling the space with a stench that made Martin gag. The creature's glowing eyes narrowed, and it lunged forward with sickening speed. But this time, Martin was ready. With a grunt, he ducked, diving to the side, just as the creature's claws slashed through the air, where his head had been a split second earlier. His body slammed against the cold stone floor, pain shooting up his spine, but it was enough. He scrambled to his feet, hands shaking as he pushed himself to a standing position. The creature snarled, its long fingers flexing as it stalked him, a predator scenting its prey. But something was different this time. Martin could feel it, the change in the air. The energy in the room had shifted. It was no longer just the creature he had to fear. It was the lighthouse. The whole damn tower had come alive, and whatever was happening within its walls had a purpose, a reason for bringing him here. The voice in his head, no longer soft, but loud and clear, spoke again. It feeds on the souls of those who come for it. The light is its lure. Its lure. You have to stop it, Martin. If the light goes out, it will consume you. All of you. It will be too late. The creature hissed again, its body twisting in unnatural ways, as though it was part of the lighthouse itself. Martin's mind raced, and instinctively, his eyes darted upward toward the ceiling. The light above him, the massive rotating lens. The heart of the lighthouse stood there, flickering. It seemed weak, as if struggling against the very dark that surrounded it. The light was dim, flickering, fading in and out. But as it did, the creature became more frenzied, more desperate. The connection was clear now. The creature and the light were linked. If the light failed, the creature, whatever it was, would be set free, able to roam the earth, feeding on whoever it could find. Martin realized, with sudden clarity, that Roderick Graves had been trying to keep the light alive all these years, and in doing so, had trapped himself in the same nightmare. The darkness of the lighthouse had become a living, breathing thing. He had to stop it. Martin stumbled toward the spiral staircase, the weight of the creature's eyes on his back, its hunger palpable. He pushed past the pain, his legs feeling like lead as he ascended the stairs, his mind racing. He needed to get to the top, to the mechanism that controlled the light. If the creature wanted the light to go out, it was because it knew that when it failed, the prison would be opened, and all the souls trapped within would be freed to roam the earth. Souls like Graves, souls like his own. He reached the top, his hands slick with sweat, heart hammering in his chest. The light flickered again. He could feel the thing below, the creature that had hunted him, waiting for the moment when the darkness would claim him forever. With shaking hands, Martin reached for the controls of the lens. The hum of the lighthouse surrounded him, and for a fleeting moment, the very walls seemed to close in, as if the tower were a mouth, ready to swallow him whole. The light flickered once more, dimming dangerously, and for a moment, everything went silent. In the silence, Martin heard it, the voice, the same voice that had spoken to him earlier, warning him. But this time, the words were clearer. You can't stop it. The light is already dead. And then, without warning, the light went out. The light was dead. It didn't sputter out like a candle's flame, or fade with a soft flicker, as Martin had hoped. No, it died. The air in the lighthouse felt like a tomb now, suffocating, thick with a presence so dark and malevolent, it pressed down on him from all sides. The silence that followed the extinguishing of the light was not peaceful. It was an abyssal quiet, a hollow where the sound of his own heartbeat felt unnatural, as though even his pulse were too loud for the oppressive blackness that now filled the tower. The last flicker of light had vanished, and the darkness had come alive. Martin's fingers trembled where they still gripped the cold, metal mechanism of the lens. His breath was shallow, his chest tight as the weight of the realization settled on him. The creature, the thing that had stalked him through this cursed place, was no longer bound by anything. It was free. The light had been its only prison, and now that it was gone, now that it was out, there was nothing left to stop it from claiming what it had been denied for so long. The shrill sound of the creature's voice rang through the tower. It was high-pitched, like the screech of metal on stone, a sound that would have made his very bones ache if he could have heard it for more than a fraction of a second. But the moment the noise pierced the air, he felt it, the thickening of the shadows, the living, crawling darkness that moved at the edges of his vision. It was no longer just a figure. It was a presence, a mass of pure, undiluted evil that churned through the air like a storm. Martin had seen the depths of the creature's hunger before, but now it was like a gaping maw, open wide, ready to swallow him whole. He stumbled back from the lens, but the darkness was faster, too fast. The thing was on him in an instant, its claws snapping through the black like lightning. Martin had no time to react. He felt the pressure of its hands on his throat again, this time with a force that threatened to crush his windpipe. He gasped, a choked cry escaping his lips, but the creature only squeezed harder, its cold fingers digging into his skin, drawing him into the abyss. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to warp, bending and twisting with the force of the dark energy that surged through them. The sound of the ocean outside was muffled now, as if the very world had been shut out by the monstrous presence that filled the tower. And then, in the briefest moment of clarity, the voice returned. "It's too late," it whispered, the woman's voice still faint, but now filled with an awful finality. "You can't stop it. The lighthouse is its vessel. You were never meant to escape." The voice. Was it the keeper? Martin's vision blurred, his head spinning, his chest burning from the pressure of the creature's grip. He felt the blood rush to his ears, the room spinning like a cyclone, and just when he thought he might lose himself completely, a memory pierced through the fog, a memory of the warning Graves had left behind in that faded journal. The light must never go out. But the light had gone out. The realization hit him with the force of a battering ram, and suddenly he understood. The light wasn't just a beacon. It wasn't just a source of power. It was a prison. The keeper, Roderick Graves, had been a prisoner himself, bound to the lighthouse. But more than that, he had been the guard, the last line of defense against whatever evil was hidden below the surface. The light, when it burned bright, kept that evil contained, and now that it was extinguished, a deep, bone-rattling growl rumbled from the creature's throat, pulling Martin back into the present. He was still caught in its grasp, still struggling to breathe, but as he struggled, something inside him began to change. something snapped, something deep within the pit of his stomach, and for the first time since he had entered this cursed place, he stopped fighting to survive. Instead, he fought to win. He could hear the voice now, clearer than before. Find the truth, Martin. The truth lies below. Stop it before it stops you. Below? Below. His eyes widened with realization. The basement. The very place he had feared to enter when he first arrived. The place that had been locked away for a reason. The dark, forgotten space beneath the tower, hidden behind layers of cobwebs and time. That was where it all started. That was where the evil had grown. The creature snarled again, tightening its grip, but Martin didn't care anymore. The vision of the dark sealed door in the basement burned in his mind, and the understanding of what had to be done was as clear as the salt air that filled his lungs. His heart pounded as he wrenched himself free from the creature's grasp, though his body screamed in protest. He couldn't stay here, not in this room, not with the creature closing in. The creature's growl followed him as he ran. No, staggered, toward the spiral staircase that led to the lower levels. He was gasping, struggling for breath, but every step was filled with a newfound clarity. He didn't know what waited for him down there, but the voice in his head, the lighthouse itself, told him he had no other choice. If he didn't stop whatever had been unleashed, he would become just another prisoner of the tower, another soul lost to the hunger that never stopped. He reached the bottom of the stairs, the dark basement yawning before him like the maw of a monster. His hand shook as he reached for the rusty old door, the hinges creaking in protest as he wrenched it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, but there was something else, something colder, deeper, that made his skin crawl. A presence, a force. The shadows seemed to reach for him, but Martin pressed forward. He had to find it, whatever it was. His hand brushed against something cold and metal, a lever. His heart leaped in his chest as he pulled it down. The sound that followed was not just a noise. It was a shift, a deep, violent rattle from within the foundations of the lighthouse. And then, the floor beneath him cracked. For a split second, there was only silence. Then, the entire lighthouse seemed to shake, as if some ancient power had awakened deep within its bowels. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker, and in that final moment, Martin realized what was happening. The lighthouse was falling. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this chilling story. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a new story, and stay tuned for even more eerie adventures. Sleep tight, if you dare.